The year is 1095. A chill wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, swept through the French town of Clermont as Pope Urban II stood before a vast, expectant crowd. His voice, clear and resonant, cut through the autumn air, painting a vivid, harrowing picture of Christian suffering in the distant East. He spoke of Jerusalem, the holiest of cities, now under the dominion of Seljuk Turks, and of pilgrims harassed, churches defiled, and the sacred sites desecrated. His words were a spark, igniting a fervour that would soon consume Europe, setting in motion a series of events we now remember as the Crusades. Before Urban's impassioned plea, the concept of a holy war, sanctioned by the Church and promising spiritual rewards, was not entirely new. For centuries, Christian rulers had fought against pagan incursions and Muslim expansion in Spain, often with the blessing of the papacy. But this was different. This was a call to arms on an unprecedented scale. A pan-European movement, directed not at a local threat, but at a distant, almost mythical land. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern bulwark of Christendom, had been steadily losing ground to the Seljuk Turks since their decisive victory at Manzikert in 1071. Emperor Alexius I Komnenos, facing the imminent collapse of his borders, had sent desperate pleas for military aid to the west. He sought mercenaries, professional soldiers, to bolster his armies. What he received, however, was something far grander and far more chaotic. Urban II, a shrewd and politically astute pontiff, saw an opportunity not just to aid the Byzantines, but to reassert papal authority, to channel the restless energies of Europe's warring nobility, and perhaps to heal the schism that had divided the Eastern and Western churches since 1054. His sermon at Clermont was a masterful piece of rhetoric, weaving together religious zeal, feudal obligation, and the promise of both earthly spoils and heavenly salvation. He offered a plenary indulgence, the full remission of temporal punishment for sins, to all who would take up the cross and journey to Jerusalem. This was a revolutionary concept, a spiritual reward of immense magnitude, appealing to a populace deeply concerned with their eternal souls. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Cries of Deus vult, God wills it, echoed through the assembly. Thousands, from powerful lords to landless peasants, knelt to receive the cross, a simple cloth emblem sewn onto their garments, signifying their sacred vow. This was not a carefully planned military campaign, at least not initially. It was a spontaneous outpouring of faith, desperation, and a yearning for adventure. The motivations of these early crusaders were complex and varied. For some, it was genuine piety, a desire to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. For others, it was the lure of land and wealth in the East, a chance to escape poverty or the constraints of feudal society. Younger sons, with little hope of inheritance, saw an opportunity to carve out new domains. Still others were driven by a sense of penitence, believing the arduous journey and the fight against infidels would atone for their sins. The first wave of crusaders, often referred to as the People's Crusade, was a testament to the sheer power of Urban's message. Led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, a gaunt, barefoot monk who rode a donkey and preached with fiery conviction, tens of thousands of common folk, many unarmed and unprepared, began their march eastward in the spring of 1096. This was a chaotic, ill-disciplined host, a mixture of peasants, women, children, and a smattering of minor knights. They lacked provisions, military training, and any real understanding of the immense distances and dangers that lay ahead. Their journey across Europe was marked by widespread disorder, looting, and violence, particularly against Jewish communities in the Rhineland. These communities long tolerated. Suddenly, Yol found themselves the target of Crusader zealots who questioned why they should travel thousands of miles to fight infidels when unbelievers lived among them. Massacres occurred in Mainz, Worms, and Cologne. Horrific episodes that cast a dark shadow over the nascent movement. Historians still debate the precise extent of the Church's complicity in these atrocities. While Urban II had explicitly forbidden harm to Jews, his message, amplified by popular preachers, often devolved into a simplistic us versus them narrative that could easily be twisted to justify violence against any perceived enemy of Christ. The People's Crusade, driven by fervent but often misguided faith, was a tragic prelude to the more organized military expedition that followed. When they finally reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexius, aghast at their depredations and disarray, quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, hoping to be rid of them. There, in the summer and autumn of 1096, they were almost entirely annihilated by the Seljuk Turks, their untrained ranks no match for disciplined cavalry. Thousands perished, their bones bleaching under the Anatolian sun, a grim warning to those who would follow. Meanwhile, the main body of the First Crusade, composed of feudal armies led by some of Europe's most powerful nobles, was slowly gathering. Unlike the People's Crusade, these were organized forces, though still lacking a single supreme commander. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most powerful lords in southern France, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy known for his military prowess and ambition, and Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy and son of William the Conqueror. These were just some of the formidable figures who led their retinues towards the east. Each lord commanded his own contingent, bound by feudal loyalties, but often suspicious and competitive with one another. This lack of a unified command would be a recurring theme throughout the Crusades, often leading to internal strife and strategic disagreements. The journey itself was an epic undertaking, a testament to the sheer logistical challenges of medieval warfare. Thousands of knights, foot soldiers, and camp followers, along with their horses, supplies, and equipment, had to traverse vast distances across mountains, rivers, and plains. The logistical challenges were immense. Feeding such a large army, providing water, and maintaining discipline over months of travel required an organizational feat that was often beyond the capabilities of the individual leaders. They largely relied on foraging, requisitioning, and sometimes outright plunder to sustain themselves, further alienating the local populations they passed through. As these disparate armies converged on Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, Emperor Alexius I found himself in a precarious position. He had asked for aid, but he had not anticipated such a massive, potentially unruly host. His primary concern was to regain lost Byzantine territory, particularly in Asia Minor, and he sought to bind the Crusader leaders with oaths of fealty, requiring them to swear that any lands conquered from the Turks that had previously belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be returned to his control. This was a point of contention from the outset. While some leaders, like Godfrey of Bouillon, reluctantly swore the oath, others, like Raymond of Toulouse, equivocated, and Bohemond of Taranto, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity to carve out his own domain. This underlying tension between Byzantine imperial aims and Crusader ambitions would simmer throughout the entire campaign. The Crusader armies, a motley collection of Franks, Normans, Flemings, and others, eventually crossed into Asia Minor, their eyes fixed on the distant prize of Jerusalem. Their first major test came with the Siege of Nicaea in May 1097. Nicaea, a strategical, important city, was the Seljuk capital in Anatolia. The siege was arduous, marked by fierce resistance from the Turkish defenders. The Crusaders, though lacking sophisticated siege engines, eventually managed to encircle the city. However, in a move that infuriated the Crusader leaders, Alexios I, fearing the city would be sacked and its Christian inhabitants harmed, secretly negotiated a surrender with the Turks, allowing Byzantine forces to enter and secure the city before the Crusaders could claim their spoils. This act, while perhaps pragmatic from the Byzantine perspective, deepened the mistrust between the Crusaders and their imperial allies. After Nicaea, the Crusader army, now numbering perhaps 30,000 to 35,000 fighting men, along with a vast number of non-combatants, continued its march through the scorching Anatolian interior. The journey was grueling, marked by intense heat, lack of water, and constant skirmishes with Turkish raiding parties. The sheer scale of their suffering is difficult to imagine today. Many died of thirst, hunger, or disease. Horses perished in large numbers, forcing knights to fight as infantry. It was during this arduous trek that the Crusaders encountered the full might of the Seljuk army at the Battle of Dorylaeum in July 1097. The Turks, employing their characteristic hit-and-run tactics, initially caught the Crusader vanguard, led by Bohemond, by surprise. The battle was fierce and desperate, with the Crusaders forming a defensive circle, their backs to the wall, until the arrival of the main Crusader force under Godfrey and Raymond turned the tide. The Seljuks, unaccustomed to such stubborn, heavy infantry, were eventually routed, suffering heavy casualties. Dorylaeum was a crucial victory, opening the path through Anatolia and demonstrating the Crusaders' resilience and fighting prowess. The path to Antioch, the next major objective, was long and arduous. For months, the Crusaders traversed hostile territory, enduring constant harassment and dwindling supplies. Antioch, a vast, heavily fortified city, was one of the jewels of the Levant, a strategic prize that controlled access to Syria and the Holy Land. Its walls, dating back to Roman times, were formidable, making a direct assault almost impossible. The Siege of Antioch, which began in October 1097, would prove to be the most grueling and protracted challenge of the entire First Crusade, lasting for 8 long months. During the siege, the Crusaders themselves faced immense hardship. Winter set in, bringing bitter cold, rain, and disease. Famine became rampant, forcing them to eat their horses, and even, according to some accounts, resort to cannibalism of fallen enemies. Desertions became common, with many losing hope. The Byzantine general Tatikios, who had accompanied the Crusaders, abandoned them, further straining relations. Yet despite these immense difficulties, the Crusaders held on, their resolve fueled by their religious zeal and the promise of Jerusalem. A moment of profound crisis and miraculous salvation occurred in June 1098. Just as the Crusaders were on the brink of starvation and despair, a stroke of luck, or perhaps divine intervention, changed their fortunes. Bohemond of Taranto, through a local Armenian convert, discovered a weak point in the city's defences. A tower manned by a disgruntled Armenian guard was vulnerable. Under the cover of darkness, Bohemon's forces scaled the walls, opened a gate, and the Crusaders poured into the city. Antioch fell in a bloody massacre, with the Muslim inhabitants put to the sword. However, their triumph was short-lived. Just days after their capture of Antioch, a massive Turkish relief army, led by Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, arrived and immediately besieged the Crusaders inside the city. The situation was desperate. Trapped within the walls they had just taken, exhausted, and facing a numerically superior enemy, the Crusaders were once again on the verge of annihilation. It was at this critical juncture that a new wave of religious fervour swept through the beleaguered army. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had visions, leading him to discover the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, buried beneath the floor of St. Peter's Cathedral in Antioch. Whether a genuine relic or a clever fabrication, the discovery of the lance acted as a powerful morale booster, convincing many Crusaders that God was truly on their side. Emboldened by this miraculous find, and with little left to lose, the Crusaders, led by Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond, launched a desperate sally against Kerboga's forces. In a surprising turn of events, the Turkish army, perhaps overconfident or disunited, broke and fled. The Battle of Antioch, fought on June 28, 2098, was a decisive victory, securing the city for the Crusaders and opening the final path to Jerusalem. The capture of Antioch, however, also led to further internal disputes. Bohemond, despite his oath to Alexios, refused to return the city to Byzantine control, establishing the Principality of Antioch, the first of the Crusader States. This act solidified the rift between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, who felt betrayed and increasingly viewed the Crusaders as a threat rather than allies. The final leg of the journey to Jerusalem was still fraught with peril, but the Crusaders, now hardened veterans, pressed on. Along the way, they established another Crusader state, the County of Edessa, under Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, who had diverted from the main army to secure his own domain. This further demonstrated the individual ambitions that often overshadowed the collective religious goal. By June 1099, a considerably smaller but determined Crusader force, perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 strong, finally stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The site of the Holy City, shimmering in the distance, after years of arduous travel and brutal warfare, must have been an overwhelming moment for many. Jerusalem was then under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, who had only recently recaptured it from the Seljuk Turks. The Fatimids, aware of the Crusaders' approach, had expelled the city's Christian population and strengthened its defences. The Crusaders, exhausted and short on supplies, immediately launched an assault, but the city's formidable walls proved impregnable. The initial attacks were repulsed with heavy losses. Despair began to set in once more. However, the arrival of Genoese and English ships at the port of Jaffa, carrying much-needed supplies and, crucially, skilled engineers and timber, revitalized the siege. With these resources, the Crusaders constructed two massive siege towers. After weeks of intense labor and prayer, a final coordinated assault was launched on July 13, 1099. The fighting was ferocious, but on July 15th, Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower finally breached the northern wall. The Crusaders poured into the city. What followed was a horrific massacre. The Crusaders, fueled by religious zeal, vengeance for their fallen comrades, and the belief that they were cleansing the holy city, slaughtered most of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Eyewitness accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe rivers of blood flowing through the streets. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were desecrated. While some historians argue that the scale of the massacre may have been exaggerated in contemporary accounts, there is no doubt that it was a brutal and indiscriminate act of violence that left an indelible stain on the legacy of the First Crusade. This event, more than any other, cemented the image of the Crusaders as barbaric invaders in the eyes of the Muslim world. With Jerusalem captured, the Crusaders had achieved their primary objective. The Holy Sepulchre was liberated. But the question of who would rule the newly conquered city remained. Raymond of Toulouse, the most powerful of the remaining lords, refused the crown, perhaps out of genuine piety, or perhaps because he did not want to be seen as king in the place where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious and respected leader, eventually accepted the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, establishing the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Other Crusader states, such as the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli, were also established, creating a string of Western European enclaves along the Syrian and Palestinian coasts. The First Crusade, against all odds, had been a stunning success. An ill-equipped, often disorganized, but fiercely determined force had carved out a kingdom in the east, thousands of miles from home. It was a testament to the power of religious conviction, the military prowess of European knights, and the disunity of their Muslim adversaries. The Seljuk Turks, fragmented into warring emirates, were unable to mount a unified defense, and the Fatimid Caliphate was weakened and isolated. This initial success, however, would sow the seeds for centuries of conflict, forever changing the political and religious landscape of the Near East and Europe. The Crusader States, isolated islands in a hostile sea, would constantly struggle for survival, their very existence dependent on a continuous flow of men and resources from the West. The memory of the First Crusade, both its triumphs and its atrocities, would resonate through history, shaping perceptions and fueling future conflicts. The call to arms had been answered, and the world would never be the same. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The year 1099 dawned with a stark clarity for the Crusaders. After years of relentless marching, brutal sieges, and unimaginable hardship, they stood at the gates of Jerusalem. The city, sacred to three great faiths, shimmered on the horizon, a mirage of salvation and conquest. It was a moment etched into the very soul of the expedition, the culmination of vows made and sacrifices rendered. Yet, the challenges were immense. The Crusader army, once numbering in the tens of thousands, was now a fraction of its original strength, weakened by disease, desertion, and constant warfare. They were a ragged, sun-baked host, far from the gleaming knights depicted in later chronicles. Jerusalem itself was a formidable fortress. Its ancient walls, strengthened by centuries of successive rulers, rose steeply from the surrounding valleys, a formidable barrier against any assault. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, was a seasoned commander, and he had taken every precaution. Wells outside the city had been poisoned or filled, and a large garrison of Egyptian and local troops stood ready to defend the holy city. The Crusaders, arriving in early June, found themselves in a desperate situation. Water was scarce, food was dwindling, and the summer heat was merciless. Morale, buoyed by the sight of their ultimate goal, was also fragile, constantly threatened by the harsh realities of their siege. The initial assaults were repelled with heavy losses. The Crusaders lacked the siege engines necessary to breach the thick walls, and their attempts to scale them with ladders proved futile against the determined defenders. A sense of despair began to creep through the ranks. Some, in their desperation, resorted to prayer and fasting, believing that only divine intervention could grant them victory. Others, more pragmatic, began to scour the surrounding countryside for timber, dismantling houses and even small ships that had been brought overland from the coast to construct two massive siege towers. This monumental effort, undertaken in secret and under constant harassment from the Fatimid garrison, was a testament to their unwavering resolve. The construction took weeks, each beam hauled and shaped under the scorching sun, every nail hammered with the weight of their pilgrimage. On July 13, 1099, the Crusaders launched their final, desperate assault. The air was thick with the dust of battle and the acrid smell of burning wood. From the north, Raymond of St. Gilles' forces attacked, while Godfrey of Bouillon and Tancred focused their efforts on the weaker northern wall. The siege towers, now complete, slowly rumbled towards the city, their massive frames casting long shadows. For 2 days, the battle raged. Arrows rained down from the walls, stones were hurled, and boiling oil scalded those attempting to breach the defences. The defenders fought with equal ferocity, knowing that their lives and the fate of the city hung in the balance. Then, on the morning of July 15th, a breakthrough. Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower, after a night of relentless battering, finally gained purchase against the wall. A small group of knights, led by a Flemish knight named Lethold, managed to cross a makeshift bridge from the tower onto the ramparts. This breach, small as it was, created a ripple effect of panic among the defenders. Soon, more Crusaders poured in, overwhelming the Fatimid resistance at that section of the wall. The gates were eventually opened from within, and the floodgates of retribution and chaos were unleashed. What followed was a dark chapter in the history of the Crusades, a stain that would forever mar the narrative of a holy war. The Crusaders, fueled by religious fervour, exhaustion, and a thirst for vengeance after years of brutal warfare, unleashed a horrific massacre upon the city's inhabitants. Muslims, Jews, and even some local Christians were indiscriminately slaughtered. Contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe rivers of blood flowing through the streets. Raymond of Aguilar's, a chronicler who was present at the siege, famously wrote of Crusaders wading knee-deep in the blood of the slain. While such accounts might contain elements of hyperbole, the scale of the violence was undeniably immense. The Dome of the Rock, a sacred Muslim shrine, was reportedly plundered and its treasures carried away. This horrific event, known as the Sack of Jerusalem, profoundly shocked the Muslim world and cemented a legacy of bitterness that would endure for centuries. Historians still debate the exact number of casualties, with estimates ranging from thousands to tens of thousands, but there is no dispute about the brutal nature of the conquest. It was a moment of profound religious zealotry intertwined with medieval military ruthlessness. With Jerusalem firmly in their grasp, the Crusaders faced a new challenge: how to govern their conquered territories. The initial impulse was to return home, their vows fulfilled. Many did, including some prominent leaders, but others, recognizing the strategic and religious importance of their gains, understood the necessity of establishing a lasting presence. Thus began the creation of the Latin states of the Levant, a series of European-style feudal entities carved out of the heart of the Muslim world. The first of these was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon, initially offered the title of king, famously refused to wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He instead adopted the more humble title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, signifying his role as a protector of the holy sites. However, upon his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin I accepted the title of king, establishing a hereditary monarchy that would last for nearly 2 centuries. The kingdom was a patchwork of lordships and fiefdoms, often granted to the very knights who had participated in the conquest. These lords, many of whom had little experience governing in such a foreign land, found themselves surrounded by a predominantly Muslim and Eastern Christian population. Beyond the Kingdom of Jerusalem, other Latin states emerged. The county of Edessa, established by Baldwin of Bouillon before the final assault on Jerusalem, was the first Crusader state, situated strategically on the Euphrates. To its south lay the Principality of Antioch, founded by Bohemond of Taranto after a grueling siege, and the county of Tripoli, eventually established by Raymond of St. Gilles after a prolonged struggle. These states, often referred to collectively as Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea, were precarious outposts of Western European culture and power in a largely hostile environment. The administration of these new states was a complex affair. The Crusaders, accustomed to the feudal systems of Europe, attempted to impose a similar structure on their new territories. Land was distributed among the nobility in exchange for military service, and a system of courts and laws was established, largely based on Western models. However, things were in preparing for peaceful proclamations. The First Crusader state was a complex affair, established by Baldwin of Bouillon before the final assault on Jerusalem. While such accounts might contain elements of hyperbole, it's no dispute about the brutal nature of the conquest. It was a moment of profound religious zealotry, intertwined with medieval military ruthlessness. The unique circumstances of Outre-mer necessitated adaptations. The vast majority of the population was not Latin Christian. They were Muslims, Eastern Christians, such as Orthodox, Armenian, and Syriac Christians, and Jews, all with their own established legal and social customs. The Crusaders, a small ruling elite, largely allowed these communities to continue practicing their religions and maintaining their own legal systems, albeit under Latin oversight and subject to taxation. This pragmatic approach, born of necessity rather than tolerance, allowed for a degree of coexistence, though tensions often simmered beneath the surface. One of the lesser-known aspects of Crusader rule was the surprisingly diverse ethnic and linguistic makeup of their armies and populations. While the leadership was predominantly French-speaking, the rank and file included Flemings, Germans, Norm, Ans, Italians, and even some English. Over time, a distinct Outre-mer identity began to emerge among those who settled permanently. They adopted local customs, sometimes married local women, and even learned Arabic, becoming known as Poulains, a term whose etymology is debated, but likely refers to a foal or native-born. These Poulains often found themselves caught between their European heritage and their Eastern reality, sometimes viewed with suspicion by new arrivals from Europe. The military defense of these fragile states was a constant preoccupation. Surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors, the Fatimids in Egypt, the Seljuks in Anatolia and Syria, and various independent emirs, the Crusader states were in a perpetual state of war or uneasy truce. They built an extensive network of castles, some of the most impressive fortifications of the medieval world, to defend their borders and control strategic routes. Crac de Chevaliers, Margat and Seyford are just a few examples of these massive strongholds, whose imposing ruins still stand today as a testament to Crusader engineering and their constant need for defense. To bolster their limited manpower, the Crusaders also relied heavily on the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These unique organizations, combining monastic vows with military prowess, were founded specifically to protect pilgrims and defend the Holy Land. They became elite fighting forces, fiercely dedicated and highly disciplined, often forming the vanguard of Crusader armies and garrisoning key castles. Their wealth, accumulated through donations from Europe, allowed them to build and maintain extensive fortifications and recruit professional soldiers, becoming indispensable to the survival of Outremer. The Templars, for instance, became so powerful and wealthy that they effectively functioned as an international banking system for a time, lending money to kings and popes alike. Despite these efforts, the Latin states were inherently vulnerable. Their population was small, and they were geographically isolated from their European homelands. Reinforcements and supplies had to travel thousands of miles by sea, a perilous and expensive journey. Furthermore, the Crusader states were often plagued by internal squabbles and rivalries among their own nobility, weakening their collective strength. The constant need for new crusades from Europe, often spurred by appeals for aid from Outremer, highlights their perpetual state of insecurity. The Muslim world, initially fragmented and caught off guard by the First Crusade, slowly began to coalesce in response to the Crusader presence. While the initial conquest of Jerusalem had been a shock, the Muslim leaders were not idle. Figures like Imad ad-Din Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din, and later the legendary Saladin, would emerge to challenge the Crusader presence, eventually leading to a renewed jihad against the Latin states. The Crusader conquest of Jerusalem, while a triumph for Christendom, sowed the seeds of a long and bloody conflict that would define the next 2 centuries. The fall of Edessa to Zengi in 1144, marking the first major loss for the Crusaders, sent shockwaves through Europe and triggered the Second Crusade. This event underscores a crucial point. The Latin states, though established, were never truly secure. Their existence was a constant struggle against a numerically superior and increasingly unified Muslim opposition. The initial success of the First Crusade, a seemingly miraculous achievement against overwhelming odds, had created a fragile edifice that would require continuous effort and sacrifice to maintain. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, stories of both triumph and tragedy, of faith and savagery, of a clash of civilizations that would forever alter the course of history. The establishment of the Latin states was not merely a military occupation. It was an attempt to transplant an entire culture and system of governance into a profoundly different environment. The Crusaders brought with them their laws, their architecture, their religious institutions, and their feudal structures. Yet they also absorbed elements from the local cultures, creating a unique hybrid society that was neither fully European nor fully Eastern. The economic life of the Crusader states was heavily reliant on trade. The port cities like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa became vital hubs connecting east and west. European merchants, particularly from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, established lucrative trading posts, exchanging European goods for spices, silks, and other exotic products from the east. This trade brought wealth to the Crusader states, but also fostered closer ties with European powers, making them even more dependent on external support. The very existence of these states, nestled precariously between powerful empires, was a testament to both their tenacity and their inherent vulnerability. They were a grand, audacious experiment, born of religious fervor and military might, yet destined to be a temporary, though impactful, chapter in the long history of the Middle East. The First Crusade had carved out a new world in the Levant, a collection of Latin states precariously perched on the edge of a hostile sea and an even more hostile interior. Jerusalem, the jewel in the crown, was now Christian, but its defense was a constant, gnawing anxiety. The journey from Europe was long and perilous, supplies often meagre, and the indigenous Christian populations, while sometimes allies, were often too few or too wary to offer substantial military aid. The Crusaders, many of whom had fulfilled their vows by reaching the Holy City, were beginning to drift back to their homes in the West, leaving behind a dwindling number of knights and settlers to guard their hard-won territories. It was in this crucible of necessity and fervent belief that a new, unprecedented form of religious life would emerge: the military orders. Imagine a knight, his armor gleaming under the Levantine sun, but instead of the usual heraldry, he wears a simple white surcoat emblazoned with a red cross. Beneath the mail, a monk's habit. This was the revolutionary fusion that characterized the military orders. Men who took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded swords and lances in God's name. They were monks, yes, but monks trained for battle, sworn to protect pilgrims and defend the Holy Land. This was a concept utterly new to the Christian world, a radical reinterpretation of the sacred and the profane, and it would profoundly shape the destiny of the Crusader States. The first of these orders, and perhaps the most iconic, was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, more commonly known as the Knights Templar. Their origins are shrouded in a certain romantic mystique. Around 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens, along with 8 companions, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Their proposal was audacious. They would dedicate themselves to the protection of pilgrims traveling to and from the holy sites, a journey fraught with danger from bandits and hostile raiders. Baldwin, recognizing the desperate need for such a force, granted them quarters in a wing of his palace, which was believed to stand on the site of Solomon's temple, hence their enduring name. For nearly a decade, these 9 knights lived in relative obscurity, their numbers growing slowly. They were truly poor, relying on donations and the generosity of the king, and their early emblem, depicting 2 knights riding a single horse, symbolized their humility and shared poverty. But their fortunes were about to change dramatically. In 1129, the Council of Troyes officially recognized the Templars. This council, influenced by the powerful Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, gave the order a formal rule largely based on the Cistercian model, and a powerful endorsement. Bernard, a man of immense spiritual authority, penned a treatise, De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood, which eloquently articulated the theological justification for these warrior monks. It was not murder, but malicide, the killing of evil. This powerful intellectual and spiritual backing transformed the Templars from a small, struggling band into a formidable international organization. From that point forward, donations poured in. Land, money, recruits. The Templars quickly became one of the wealthiest and most influential institutions in Christendom. Their white surcoats with the distinctive red cross became a symbol of courage and devotion. They built impressive castles, like the formidable Crac de Chevalier. Though this was initially built by the Hospitallers, the Templars also constructed many equally impressive fortresses and established a vast network of preceptories across Europe, which served as recruiting and fundraising centers. These preceptories managed the order's vast estates, providing a steady income stream that funded their operations in the East. They also developed sophisticated financial systems, effectively becoming early international bankers, safeguarding funds for pilgrims and even monarchs. Almost concurrently, another great order rose to prominence: the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, or the Hospitallers. Their origins were even older than the Templars, tracing back to a hospital established in Jerusalem around 1070 by Amalfitan merchants, long before the First Crusade. This hospital cared for sick and poor pilgrims, regardless of their faith. After the First Crusade, the hospital continued its charitable work, and its master, Gerard Tom, organized it into a religious order under papal protection in 1113. Initially, their focus was purely on medical care and hospitality. But the harsh realities of the Crusader States soon compelled them to adopt a military role. By the mid-12th century, they too were fielding knights, their black, later red surcoats adorned with a white eight-pointed cross. The Hospitallers, like the Templars, became a powerful military force, constructing and garrisoning numerous castles throughout the Levant, such as their magnificent fortress at Margat. They were often at the forefront of battles, their discipline and training making them formidable opponents. Yet, unlike the Templars, they never fully abandoned their original charitable mission. Throughout their history, they continued to operate hospitals, providing medical care to crusaders, pilgrims, and even local populations. This dual role of warrior and healer gave the Hospitallers a unique character, a blend of martial prowess and compassionate service. A third, though lesser known, major military order was the Teutonic Knights, or the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. Their origins lay in a field hospital established by German pilgrims during the Siege of Acre in 1190, during the Third Crusade. Initially, they focused on caring for German pilgrims and crusaders, much like the early Hospitallers. However, by 1198, they were formally recognized as a military order, adopting a rule similar to the Templars and Hospitallers, with a focus on protecting German interests in the Holy Land. Their distinctive white surcoats bore a black cross. While they played a significant role in the Crusades, their greatest impact would later be felt in Eastern Europe, where they embarked on their own crusades against pagan populations in Prussia and Livonia, establishing a powerful monastic state. These military orders represented a new paradigm in medieval society. They were not merely soldiers. They were religious professionals, bound by strict rules and a deep sense of purpose. They were the elite shock troops of the Crusader States, often leading the charge in battle and holding the line in desperate defenses. Their discipline, their unwavering commitment, and their belief that they were fighting for God made them exceptionally effective. They were also independent of local secular rulers, answering directly to the Pope, which often led to tensions and rivalries with the kings and princes of the Crusader States. The daily life within these orders was a stark blend of monastic austerity and military rigor. A Templar or Hospitaller knight would rise early for prayers, attend Mass, and then spend his day in military training, maintaining his weapons and armor, or performing administrative duties. Meals were taken in silence, often with a reading from scripture. The knights were forbidden from personal possessions, gambling, hunting, or engaging in worldly pleasures. Their lives were dedicated to God and the defense of the Holy Land. Even their appearance was regulated. Templars were famously forbidden from growing long beards, a contrast to the prevailing fashion of the time. This austere lifestyle, combined with the constant threat of battle, forged a brotherhood of steel and faith. The Orders A. It attracted a different kind of recruit than the typical crusader. While many knights joined for spiritual reasons, others saw an opportunity for a structured life, a chance for redemption, or even a career path for younger sons of noble families who would not inherit land. They were often highly skilled warriors, but their strength lay not just in individual prowess, but in their cohesion and discipline as a unit. They fought as a unified force, often in wedge formations, and their charges were legendary for their ferocity. However, the rise of the military orders was not without its controversies and challenges. Their immense wealth and power often bred resentment among secular lords and even within the church hierarchy. Their independence, while a source of strength, also made them difficult to control. There were accusations of arrogance, of meddling in political affairs, and even of greed. Historians still debate the extent to which these accusations were justified or merely the product of envy and political maneuvering. What is clear is that the orders, particularly the Templars, became incredibly influential, operating almost as a state within a state, with their own castles, armies, and financial networks. One lesser-known detail about the Templars, often overlooked in the dramatic narratives of their battles, is their role in agricultural innovation. In their European preceptories, they were known for adopting advanced farming techniques, draining marshes, and introducing new crops, contributing significantly to local economies. They were not just warriors, they were also astute administrators and innovators, managing vast estates with efficiency. The relationship between the Templars and Hospitallers, the two dominant orders, was complex. While they often fought side by side against common enemies, there was also a fierce rivalry between them. They competed for donations, for recruits, and for influence. There were instances of open conflict between their forces, though these were usually quickly suppressed by papal authority. This rivalry, while sometimes detrimental, also spurred them to greater efforts, each striving to outdo the other in piety and martial valor. The military orders also faced the constant challenge of maintaining their numbers and their spiritual purity. Life in the Holy Land was brutal and attrition rates were high. Replacements had to be constantly sought from Europe, a process that became increasingly difficult as the initial fervor of the Crusades waned. Furthermore, the monastic ideal of poverty and humility was often difficult to maintain amidst immense wealth and power. There were instances of corruption and laxity, though these were likely exceptions rather than the norm. The enduring legacy of these orders is profound. They created a new ideal of Christian knighthood, blending the spiritual and the martial in a way that resonated deeply with the medieval imagination. Their castles still stand as imposing testaments to their engineering prowess and strategic vision. They were the backbone of the Crusader States, the first line of defense against the relentless pressure from the surrounding Muslim powers. Without them, it is highly probable that the Latin presence in the Levant would have collapsed far sooner. Yet, their very existence also highlighted a fundamental tension within the Crusades themselves. Was it truly possible to wage holy war while maintaining Christian virtues? Could one kill in God's name and remain pure? Bernard of Clairvaux had argued yes, but the question continued to trouble many minds. The rise of the military orders marked a significant evolution in the Crusades, transforming them from episodic expeditions into a sustained, institutionalized struggle. These warrior monks, with their unwavering faith and their formidable fighting skills, were a unique product of their age, a testament to the desperate ingenuity and fervent belief that characterized the Crusader movement. They were the guardians of the Holy Land, the sword and shield of Christ, and for nearly 2 centuries their presence defined the military landscape of the Latin East. Their white and black crosses, fluttering over battlements and through the dust of countless skirmishes, were a constant reminder of the West's enduring and often bloody commitment to Jerusalem. The wind, it seemed, carried not only the dust of the desert, but also the whispers of change, a growing discontent that stirred the hearts of the Islamic world. For decades, the Frankish presence had been a thorn, a persistent irritation, but never an existential threat to the vast, sprawling caliphates. Now, however, a new fervour was taking root, a powerful resurgence of religious zeal and military might. The catalyst, the spark that ignited this smouldering resentment into a roaring flame, was the fall of Edessa. Edessa, the first of the Crusader States, had always been a somewhat isolated outpost, a Christian island in a sea of Muslim territories. Its strategic importance was undeniable, controlling vital trade routes and acting as a buffer against the Seljuk Turks. Yet its very isolation made it vulnerable. Its count, Jocelyn II, was often absent, more concerned with political maneuvering in Antioch than with the defense of his own city. This negligence would prove fatal. Into this volatile landscape stepped Imad ad-Din Zengi, a name that would soon echo with both terror and triumph across the Middle East. Zengi was an Atabeg, a Turkish governor, of Mosul and Aleppo, a man of immense ambition and military genius. He was a figure forged in the crucible of Seljuk internecine warfare, ruthless and calculating, yet also capable of inspiring fierce loyalty in his troops. He saw in the fragmented Crusader states not just an enemy, but an opportunity to unite the disparate Muslim principalities under his banner, and crucially, to reclaim lands lost to the Franks. The year was 1144. Zengi, ever the opportunist, learned that Jocelyn II had ridden out of Edessa with the bulk of his army to support an ally in Aleppo. Seeing his chance, Zengi swiftly moved his forces, laying siege to the city in late November. The people of Edessa, a diverse mix of Armenians, Syrians, and a smaller Frankish population, found themselves ill-prepared and undermanned. The walls, though formidable, were not impregnable, and the defenders lacked the numbers to man them effectively against Zengi's determined assault. For weeks, the siege dragged on, a grueling test of endurance. Zengi's engineers worked tirelessly, undermining the city walls, while his archers rained down a constant barrage of arrows. The sounds of war, the thud of siege engines, the shouts of soldiers, the cries of the wounded, filled the air, a grim symphony of destruction. Finally, on December 24th, 1144, Christmas Eve, Zengi's forces breached the walls. The city fell, and with it, the First Crusader state was extinguished. The taking of Edessa sent shockwaves through both the Muslim and Christian worlds. For the Muslims, it was a moment of immense jubilation, a sign that the tide was turning, that the Franks were not invincible. Zengi was hailed as a hero, a champion of Islam, and his victory became a rallying cry for jihad. For the Christians, it was a devastating blow, a stark reminder of their precarious position and the growing strength of their enemies. The news travelled slowly, agonizingly across the sea to Europe, carried by desperate envoys and merchants. The fall of Edessa was not just a military defeat, it was a profound psychological one. It shattered the illusion of Frankish permanence and ignited a powerful counter-crusade. Zengi, however, did not live long to savor his triumph. In 1146, he was assassinated by one of his own slaves, a testament to the brutal realities of power in the medieval Middle East. But his legacy lived on, carried forward by his son, Nur ad-Din Zengi. Nur ad-Din was, in many ways, an even more formidable figure than his father. Where Zengi was a pragmatic warrior, Nur ad-Din was a deeply pious and intellectual man, driven by an unshakable faith and a burning desire to unite the Muslim world against the Franks. He meticulously consolidated his father's territories, expanded his influence, and crucially, fostered a powerful sense of religious identity among his subjects. He patronized scholars, built mosques and madrasas, and actively promoted the concept of jihad, not just as military conquest, but as a spiritual duty. Under Nur ad-Din, the call to holy war became more organized, more widespread, and more fervent than ever before. He saw the Franks not merely as invaders, but as infidels, a threat to the very soul of Islam. Meanwhile, in Europe, the news of Edessa's fall caused widespread consternation and alarm. Pope Eugenius III, deeply concerned by the precarious state of the Crusader territories, issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessoris in 1145, calling for a Second Crusade. This was not merely a plea for aid. It was a solemn, urgent summons to arms, promising spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross. The call was answered with enthusiasm, particularly in France and Germany. Bernard of Clairvaux, the charismatic and influential Cistercian abbot, became the spiritual engine of the crusade. His fiery sermons, delivered with passionate eloquence, stirred the hearts of thousands. He travelled throughout Europe, preaching the crusade with an almost hypnotic power, his words weaving visions of spiritual glory and earthly redemption. He promised that those who died on crusade would go straight to heaven, their sins forgiven. This message resonated deeply with a populace steeped in religious belief and yearning for spiritual certainty. Two of Europe's most powerful monarchs, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, answered the call. Louis, a pious but somewhat indecisive ruler, was perhaps swayed by the spiritual fervour of the age and the urging of his formidable wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who also joined the expedition. Conrad, a seasoned warrior, was motivated by its sense of duty and the desire to assert his prestige on the international stage. The Second Crusade, however, was plagued by misfortune and disunity from its very inception. Unlike the First Crusade, which had been a relatively unified, albeit chaotic movement, the Second Crusade was essentially two separate armies, one French and one German, each with its own leadership, its own objectives, and its own internal squabbles. This lack of coordination would prove disastrous. Conrad's German army was the first to depart, setting out in the spring of 1147. Their journey across Europe was fraught with difficulties. They encountered hostility from local populations, particularly in the Byzantine Empire, whose emperor, Manuel I Comnenus, viewed the Crusaders with deep suspicion. The Byzantines had long been wary of large Western armies passing through their lands. Fearing their rapaciousness and their potential to destabilize the region, Manuel, remembering the troubles of the First Crusade, tried to manage the German passage, but relations quickly deteriorated. Skirmishes broke out, and the Germans, already suffering from lack of supplies and disease, became increasingly demoralized. Their greatest challenge, however, lay ahead in Anatolia. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the German army's catastrophic defeat. Some argue that Conrad, inexperienced in the tactics of steppe warfare, made a series of tactical blunders. Others point to the Byzantine guides, who some crusaders believed deliberately led them into traps or provided misinformation. What is certain is that in October 1147, near Dorylaeum, the German army was ambushed and decimated by the Seljuk Turks. The Turks, employing their classic hit-and-run tactics, harassed the heavily armoured European knights, picking them off with arrows and then retreating before a full engagement could take place. The German forces, exhausted and disoriented, were virtually annihilated. Conrad himself barely escaped with his life, returning to Constantinople with a mere fraction of his original army. The French army, led by Louis VII, followed a similar path, but with slightly less catastrophic, though still deeply disappointing results. They too faced harassment from the Byzantines and the Turks, though they managed to avoid the complete destruction that befell the Germans. Louis, a devout man, often prioritized religious observances over military expediency, which sometimes led to slow progress and missed opportunities. His army, while larger and better supplied than Conrad's, was still vulnerable to the harsh terrain, disease, and the relentless attacks of the Seljuks. One of the most poignant moments of the French campaign occurred during their passage through the mountainous regions of Anatolia. In January 1148, while crossing the Cadmus Mountains, the French army, stretched out in a long, vulnerable column, was ambushed by Turkish forces. The rear guard, led by Louis himself, fought bravely, but the losses were heavy. Many non-combatants, including women and children, perished in the chaos. The experience deeply affected Louis, who, according to chroniclers, was forced to climb a tree to escape the fighting, a humbling experience for a king. By the time the French forces finally reached Antioch in March 1148, they were exhausted, demoralized, and significantly reduced in numbers. The initial enthusiasm had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim determination to simply survive. Upon their arrival in the Crusader States, a critical strategic decision had to be made. The original goal of the crusade had been to recapture Edessa. However, the remnants of the German and French armies, combined with the local Crusader forces, were far too weak to mount such an ambitious campaign in northern Syria, where Nur ad-Din's power was rapidly growing. Instead, a new target was chosen: Damascus. The decision to attack Damascus was, and remains, a subject of considerable scholarly debate. Why abandon the original objective, the reclamation of Edessa, and instead target a city that had, for the most part, maintained a relatively peaceful, if sometimes tense, relationship with the Crusader States? Damascus, a wealthy and strategically important city, was ruled by an independent emir, Onur, who had even at times allied with the Franks against Zengi. One theory suggests that the Crusader lords, particularly those from Jerusalem, saw Damascus as a more immediate and achievable prize. A rich city whose capture would significantly enhance their power and prestige. Another possibility is that they feared the growing power of Nur ad-Din and believed that taking Damascus would prevent him from eventually absorbing it into his burgeoning empire, thus creating an even more formidable enemy. Perhaps, too, there was a desire for a clear, decisive victory to salvage the morale of the Crusaders and justify the immense effort and sacrifice. Whatever the precise motivations, the decision proved to be a catastrophic error. In July 1148, the combined Crusader forces laid siege to Damascus. The initial stages of the siege went well. The Crusaders, numbering around 50,000, managed to push through the orchards surrounding the city, a vital source of food and water for the Damascenes. They established their camp close to the city walls, and for a few days, it seemed as though Damascus might fall. However, the Damascenes, under the leadership of Honor, put up a fierce resistance. They were well prepared, and their defences were strong. More critically, Honor appealed for aid from Nur ad-Din, who, seeing an opportunity to expand his influence, swiftly moved his forces towards Damascus. The arrival of Nur ad-Din's army, combined with internal divisions and mistrust among the Crusader leaders, quickly turned the tide. The Crusader commanders, particularly the local barons of Jerusalem, began to argue amongst themselves. There were disputes over who would rule Damascus if it fell, and accusations of treachery and bribery began to circulate. Some historians suggest that the local Frankish lords, perhaps fearing the establishment of a powerful new cruiser state that would overshadow their own, deliberately undermined the siege. Others believe that the Crusaders simply lacked the logistical capacity and the unity of purpose to sustain a prolonged siege against a well-defended city and a relief army. As Nur ad-Din's forces approached, the Crusader leaders made the fateful decision to move their camp to a less defensible position on the eastern side of the city, where the walls were stronger and the water supply was less accessible. This move, perhaps intended to cut off a potential escape route for the Damascenes or to meet Nur ad-Din's approaching army, proved to be a tactical blunder. It exposed their flank to the Damascene defenders and cut them off from their own water supply. Demoralized, suffering from thirst, and facing a growing threat from Nur ad-Din's army, the Crusaders abandoned the siege after only 4 days. The retreat was a humiliating spectacle, a testament to the Crusades' abject failure. The German and French armies, their hopes dashed, their ranks depleted, and their reputations tarnished, began their long, arduous journey back to Europe. The Second Crusade was, by almost any measure, a disaster. It failed to achieve any of its objectives, either the original goal of retaking Edessa or the revised goal of capturing Damascus. It severely weakened the Crusader States, leaving them more vulnerable than ever. It also significantly enhanced the prestige and power of Nur ad-Din, who emerged as the undisputed champion of jihad and the most dominant figure in the region. The failure of the crusade deepened the mistrust between the Byzantines and the Western Europeans, and it also exposed the deep divisions and rivalries within the Crusader states themselves. For the people of Europe, the failure of the Second Crusade was a profound shock. The immense effort, the vast sums of money, and the countless lives sacrificed had yielded nothing but defeat and humiliation. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had so passionately preached the crusade, was forced to defend himself against accusations of false prophecy, attributing the failure to the sins of the Crusaders rather than to God's will. The legacy of the Second Crusade was one of disillusionment and a growing sense of the formidable challenge posed by the united Muslim forces. It marked a turning point, signalling the end of the initial Frankish expansion and the beginning of a sustained Muslim counteroffensive. The stage was now set for the rise of an even greater Muslim leader, one who would finally unite Egypt and Syria and pose an existential threat to the very existence of the Crusader States. The wind, which had once carried whispers of hope across the seas, now seemed to carry the ominous rustle of approaching storm clouds. The dream of a permanent Latin East was slowly, inexorably, beginning to fade. The desert winds, so often a harbinger of change, began to whisper a new name across the sands of the Levant: Saladin. His rise was not sudden, but a slow, deliberate ascent, like the sun cresting the dunes at dawn, casting long shadows before illuminating the vast landscape. Born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in Tikrit, a city in modern-day Iraq, around 1137, Saladin was a Kurd, not an Arab, a detail often overlooked in the grand tapestry of his legend. He began his career in the service of Nur ad-Din, the powerful Zengid ruler of Syria, who had long dreamed of expelling the Franks from the Holy Land. Saladin's early years were spent learning the intricate dance of Mamluk politics and military strategy, observing how power was wielded and how alliances were forged and broken. He possessed a keen intellect, a deep understanding of Islamic law, and a charisma that drew men to his banner. His true opportunity arrived when he was sent to Egypt in 1164 with his uncle Shirkuh to aid the Fatimid Caliphate, then teetering on the brink of collapse against Crusader incursions. This expedition, and subsequent ones, saw Saladin distinguish himself, not only as a formidable warrior, but also as a shrewd diplomat. After Shirkuh's death, Saladin inherited the Vizierate of Egypt in 1169, a position of immense power. He swiftly consolidated his authority, maneuvering through the treacherous currents of Egyptian politics. He abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, which had been Shiite, and restored Sunni Islam as the official doctrine, a move that pleased the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and bolstered his legitimacy in the wider Muslim world. This was a pivotal moment, for it meant that the two major Islamic centers, Cairo and Baghdad, were now aligned under Sunni leadership, creating a powerful ideological and political front against the Crusaders. Upon Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, Saladin, now a formidable power in his own right, seized the opportunity. He marched into Damascus, claiming the mantle of leadership and declaring himself Sultan of Egypt and Syria. This act was met with resistance from Nur ad-Din's heirs and other Zengid emirs, leading to a decade of internal conflict within the Muslim world. Saladin, however, proved to be a master of both warfare and diplomacy. He patiently chipped away at his rivals, sometimes through direct confrontation, more often through skillful negotiation and strategic alliances. His reputation for justice and generosity preceded him, often convincing his opponents to yield without a fight. He understood that a unified Muslim front was essential to achieve his ultimate goal, the expulsion of the Crusaders. By 1187, Saladin had largely succeeded in unifying a vast swathe of the Muslim world, from Egypt to Syria and parts of Mesopotamia. His empire, though still a collection of semi-autonomous principalities, was bound together by his personal authority and his unwavering commitment to jihad against the Franks. This unification was a monumental achievement, something no Muslim leader had managed since the early days of Islam. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were increasingly fractured. Their internal squabbles, particularly between Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and Raymond III of Tripoli, a powerful count, weakened their collective resolve. The Latin kingdom, once a beacon of Frankish power, was now a patchwork of squabbling lords, many of whom were more concerned with personal gain than with the defense of the Holy Land. the stage was set for a confrontation that would forever alter the course of the Crusades. The immediate catalyst was the brazen actions of Reynald of Chatillon, a notoriously aggressive Crusader lord. In late 1186 or early 1187, Reynald attacked a Muslim caravan traveling from Egypt to Damascus, violating a truce Saladin had painstakingly established with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This act of brigandage was not an isolated incident. Reynald had a long history of preying on Muslim travelers and pilgrims, even attempting to raid Mecca and Medina at one point. For Saladin, this was the final straw. He swore a solemn oath to personally execute Reynald. In the spring of 1187, Saladin gathered his forces, an army estimated to be around 30,000 strong, at the Sea of Galilee. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. He aimed to draw the Crusader army out into the arid, waterless terrain of the Galilean hills. Far from their fortified cities and vital water sources, the Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, numbered around 20,000 men, including a significant contingent of heavily armoured knights, the backbone of their fighting force. Despite warnings from Raymond III of Tripoli, who advocated a defensive strategy, Guy, pressured by Reynald and other hot-headed lords, decided to march to the relief of Tiberias, which Saladin had besieged. The ensuing march on July 3, 1187, was a nightmare for the Crusaders. Under the scorching summer sun, burdened by their heavy armour, and constantly harassed by Saladin's light cavalry, they suffered terribly from thirst. The air shimmered with heat, and the dust kicked up by thousands of marching feet and hooves choked men and horses alike. Saladin's archers rained down arrows, further demoralizing the exhausted Franks. The most crucial decision of the day came when Guy, against Raymond's advice, chose to encamp for the night in a waterless plain, just a few miles from the precious springs of Hattin. This decision sealed their fate. The Battle of Hattin began in earnest on the morning of July 4, 1187. The Crusaders, desperate for water, made a futile attempt to break through Saladin's lines to reach the springs. Saladin's army, well supplied and strategically positioned, surrounded them on all sides. The Muslim forces set fire to the dry brush, sending smoke and heat billowing into the Crusader ranks, further exacerbating their thirst and disorienting them. The Crusader cavalry, once the terror of the East, found themselves bogged down, their heavy armour a liability in the suffocating heat and dust. Wave after wave of Saladin's disciplined archers decimated their ranks. The battle quickly devolved into a rout. Raymond III of Tripoli, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, managed to cut his way through the Muslim lines and escape, though many of his men perished. The True Cross, a revered relic carried into battle by the Crusaders, was captured, a devastating blow to their morale. By the end of the day, the Crusader army was utterly annihilated. Thousands were killed, and thousands more were captured. Among the captives were King Guy of Lusignan, Reynald of Chatillon, and many other prominent Crusader lords. Saladin, true to his oath, personally executed Reynald of Chatillon. He offered water to King Guy, a gesture of respect. But when Guy offered the same to Reynald, Saladin intervened, stating that kings do not give drink to brigands. He then beheaded Reynald himself, a stark warning to any who would violate his truces. The other captive lords were treated with a surprising degree of clemency, reflecting Saladin's chivalrous reputation. The ordinary soldiers were largely enslaved, though some were ransomed or released. The victory at Hattin was a cataclysm for the Crusader States. It effectively shattered their military power and left their cities and castles vulnerable. The news sent shockwaves across Christendom, sparking outrage and calls for a new crusade. For the Muslim world, it was a moment of immense triumph, a vindication of Saladin's long struggle for unity. The path to Jerusalem was now open. Following Hattin, Saladin systematically began to reclaim the Crusader strongholds. Town after town, castle after castle, fell to his forces. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, and many others surrendered with little resistance. The remaining Crusader garrisons, demoralized and isolated, often negotiated favorable terms of surrender, allowing them to depart for other Crusader territories. Saladin's approach was often pragmatic. He preferred surrender to costly sieges, and his reputation for keeping his word encouraged capitulation. The ultimate prize, of course, was Jerusalem. The city had been in Crusader hands for 88 years, since the brutal conquest of the First Crusade in 1099. Its recapture was Saladin's most cherished ambition, a symbol of Muslim resurgence and a fulfillment of his religious duty. He marched on Jerusalem in September 1187, arriving before its walls on September 20th. The city was defended by a small, desperate garrison, augmented by refugees from other fallen Crusader cities. Balian of Ibelin, a respected Crusader lord who had been allowed to enter Jerusalem to retrieve his family after Hattin, was tasked with its defense. Saladin initially offered generous terms of surrender, promising safe passage for all inhabitants and their possessions. However, the defenders, fearing a repeat of the 1099 massacre, refused, vowing to fight to the last man. Saladin then began a relentless siege. His engineers undermined the walls, and his archers and siege engines pounded the defences. After 12 days of intense fighting, a section of the wall was breached. The defenders, realizing their position was hopeless, appealed to Balian to negotiate. Balian rode out to meet Saladin, warning him that if the Muslims continued their assault, the defenders would destroy the holy sites within the city, kill their own families, and then charge out to fight to the death, leaving Saladin with nothing but a ruined city and a bloody victory. This threat, though perhaps a desperate bluff, resonated with Saladin's sense of honor and his desire to preserve the sanctity of Jerusalem. After much deliberation, Saladin agreed to new terms. The Christian inhabitants would be allowed to leave the city upon payment of a ransom. Men would pay 10 dinars, women 5, and children 1. Those who could not pay would be enslaved. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The recapture of the city was a moment of immense spiritual significance for the Muslim world. Unlike the Crusaders' bloody conquest, Saladin's entry was marked by a remarkable degree of restraint and clemency. He ordered the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock to be cleansed of Crusader alterations and restored to their original Islamic glory. The golden cross that had adorned the Dome of the Rock for nearly a century was removed. Saladin's actions in Jerusalem solidified his image as a chivalrous and just ruler. He allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy Sepulchre, albeit under Muslim supervision, and protected Christian holy sites. He even granted special dispensation to many poor Christians, allowing them to leave without paying the ransom, a testament to his generosity. His brother Al-Adil and even Saladin himself paid ransoms for thousands of individuals, demonstrating a compassion rarely seen in medieval warfare. This act of mercy stood in stark contrast to the massacre of 1099, a detail that resonated deeply with both contemporary and later chroniclers. The fall of Jerusalem sent a tremor of shock and grief throughout Europe. Pope Urban III reportedly died of sorrow upon hearing the news, though historians still debate the exact cause of his death, as he was already an elderly man. His successor, Pope Gregory VIII, immediately issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City. This call to arms would ignite the Third Crusade, perhaps the most famous of all the Crusades, drawing the most powerful monarchs of Europe: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II Augustus of France, and Richard I, the Lionheart of England. The loss of Jerusalem was not just a military defeat, it was a profound spiritual blow to Christendom. For nearly a century, the city had been the jewel in the crown of the Crusader States, a tangible symbol of their faith and their presence in the East. Its recapture by Saladin was a powerful statement of Muslim strength and determination. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, Saladin faced challenges. His vast empire, though unified by his charisma, was still a fragile construct, held together by his personal authority. The logistical demands of governing such a sprawling territory and the constant threat of a new Crusader invasion would test his leadership in the years to come. One lesser-known detail from this period concerns the fate of the Order of the Temple and the Knights Hospitaller after Hattin. While many Crusader knights were ransomed, Saladin viewed the military orders as particularly dangerous and vowed to eliminate them. He ordered the execution of almost all captured Templars and Hospitallers, offering them a chance to convert to Islam, which they largely refused. This brutal act, though harsh by modern standards, reflected Saladin's understanding of their unwavering commitment and the existential threat they posed to his vision of a unified Islamic Levant. Their fanatical devotion, he believed, made them too dangerous to be allowed to live and fight again. The fall of Jerusalem also sparked a fascinating scholarly debate regarding Saladin's motivations. Was he primarily a religious zealot, driven by a fervent desire for jihad? Or a pragmatic statesman who skillfully used religious rhetoric to achieve political ends? Many historians argue that he was both. His personal piety was undeniable, and his commitment to Islam was deep. Yet he also demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt, to negotiate, and to build alliances, even with Christian factions when it suited his purpose. Perhaps these two aspects of his character were not contradictory, but complementary, each serving the other in his grand design to restore Islamic dominance in the region. The complexity of Saladin's character, his blend of military genius, political acumen, and personal piety, continues to fascinate historians and storytellers alike, ensuring his legend endures as one of the most compelling figures of the medieval world. The dust of the Second Crusade had long settled, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of many in the West. Jerusalem, though still Christian, felt increasingly vulnerable, a jewel in a crown that was slipping. Then, in the year 1187, a tremor ran through the very foundations of the Christian world. News carried by breathless, weary messengers arrived from the Holy Land, each word a hammer blow. Jerusalem had fallen. Saladin, the brilliant and charismatic Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had achieved what no Muslim leader since Omar had done. After a swift and decisive campaign, culminating in the devastating Battle of Hattin, where the Crusader army was virtually annihilated, Saladin had besieged and captured the Holy City. The true cross, the most revered relic in Christendom, was lost. The Dome of the Rock, which had been converted into a church by the Crusaders, was reconsecrated as a mosque. The shock was profound, echoing through the cathedrals and castles of Europe, igniting a fervent, almost desperate call for a new crusade. This was not to be a crusade like those before it, born of disparate noble ambitions or papal decrees that struggled to unite a fractured continent. This was a response of unprecedented scale, a desperate rallying cry that stirred the three most powerful monarchs of Western Europe: Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor; Philip II Augustus, King of France; and Richard I, known to history as the Lionheart, King of England. Each of these men was a titan in his own right, a figure whose very name commanded respect, fear, and loyalty. Their combined might promised a crusade of unparalleled grandeur, a force that surely could not fail to reclaim the sacred city. Frederick Barbarossa, the oldest and most experienced of the three, was the first to answer the call. A man of imposing presence, with a flowing red beard that gave him his moniker. He was a living legend, a symbol of imperial power and medieval chivalry. He took the cross in 1188, gathering an immense army, perhaps as many as 100,000 men, though such numbers are notoriously difficult to verify and likely exaggerated. His route was overland, a long and arduous journey across the Byzantine Empire and through Anatolia. It was a path fraught with danger, not just from potential enemies, but from the harsh terrain, disease, and the logistical nightmare of feeding and watering such a vast host. Barbarossa, ever the meticulous planner, tried to mitigate these challenges, but the sheer scale of his undertaking was almost beyond human capacity. His march was a testament to his iron will, a slow, inexorable advance that struck fear into the hearts of those in Constantinople and awe into the eyes of his own men. The emperor's journey, however, was destined for a tragic and unexpected end. In June of 1190, while crossing a river in Cilicia, the Salef River, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. The circumstances remain somewhat mysterious. Some accounts suggest he was attempting to cross the river on horseback, others that he was bathing in its cool waters to escape the oppressive heat. Whatever the exact cause, his death was a catastrophic blow to the crusade. His mighty army, deprived of its charismatic leader, began to fragment. Many turned back, their resolve shattered. Only a fraction, led by his son, Frederick VI, Duke of Swabia, continued on to Acre, carrying the emperor's body, preserved in vinegar, with them. The grandest contingent of the Third Crusade, the one that had promised to sweep all before it, had dissolved before it even reached the Holy Land. A stark reminder of the fragile nature of medieval campaigns and the unpredictable hand of fate. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Richard I, the Lionheart, was preparing for his own journey. Richard was the very embodiment of the chivalric ideal, a skilled warrior, a brilliant military strategist, and a poet. He was also a man of immense ambition and fiery temperament, a king who loved battle more rather than governance. His enthusiasm for the crusade was boundless, and he spared no expense in funding his expedition. He famously declared that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer, a testament to his single-minded devotion to the cause. To raise funds, he levied heavy taxes, sold off royal lands and offices, and even released the King of Scotland from his homage for a hefty sum. His preparations were meticulous, his fleet assembled with care, and his army comprised of seasoned veterans and eager young knights. Philip II Augustus, King of France, was a different kind of monarch. More pragmatic and politically astute than Richard, he was deeply committed to the crusade, but also keenly aware of the opportunities it presented for consolidating his power within France and against his rival, the English king. Philip was a shrewd statesman, a master of diplomacy and administration, and his presence on the crusade was a testament to his commitment to Christendom, but also to his desire to maintain parity, if not superiority, with his English counterpart. The relationship between Richard and Philip was a complex tapestry of alliance, rivalry, and mutual suspicion. They were ostensibly allies in a sacred cause, but beneath the surface simmered a deep-seated animosity, a struggle for dominance that would define much of their time in the Holy Land. The two kings, despite their underlying tensions, initially set out together. They met at Vézelay in July 1190, a symbolic gathering of the two most powerful Western European monarchs. From there, they travelled to Sicily, where they wintered. Their armies camped side by side, a volatile mix of English and French soldiers. It was here that the cracks in their alliance began to show more clearly. Disputes over the succession of the Sicilian throne, personal slights, and the sheer proximity of two ambitious leaders with large, often unruly armies led to frequent friction. Philip, ever the more cautious and perhaps less passionate of the two, grew weary of Richard's impetuousness and grandstanding. In the spring of 1191, the two kings finally departed Sicily, but not together. Philip sailed directly for Acre, where the remnants of Barbarossa's army and various other Crusader contingents were already engaged in a long and brutal siege. Richard, however, was delayed. A storm scattered his fleet, and some of his ships, carrying his sister Joan and his fiancée Berengaria of Navarre, were shipwrecked off the coast of Cyprus. The island's ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a self-proclaimed emperor who had broken away from Byzantium, imprisoned the survivors and seized the treasures. Richard, never one to tolerate an insult, swiftly diverted his forces, conquered Cyprus, deposed Isaac, and married Berengaria on the island. This unexpected detour provided the Crusaders with a vital strategic base, a secure supply point for future operations in the Holy Land. But it also further delayed Richard's arrival at the main theatre of war, much to Philip's chagrin. When Richard finally arrived at Acre in June 1191, his presence was a galvanizing force. The siege had been ongoing for nearly 2 years, a grinding, bloody affair that had consumed countless lives on both sides. Saladin's forces continually harassed the besiegers, and disease ravaged the Crusader camps. The arrival of the English king, with his fresh troops, siege engines, and legendary reputation, breathed new life into the flagging Christian effort. Richard immediately took charge, his strategic brilliance and personal bravery evident in his leadership. He personally directed the construction of new siege towers and the deployment of his forces, inspiring his men with his presence on the front lines. The combined might of the English and French armies, bolstered by other European contingents, proved too much for the city's defenders. After a month of intense bombardment and fierce assaults, Acre finally surrendered to the Crusaders in July. It was a momentous victory, a desperately needed morale boost for the Christian cause. However, the triumph was immediately overshadowed by renewed tensions between Richard and Philip. Philip, feeling his contributions were undervalued and perhaps weary of Richard's domineering style, announced his intention to return to France. He cited illness as his reason, but it was widely understood that he wished to consolidate his own power at home and potentially exploit Richard's prolonged absence in the East. His departure left Richard as the undisputed, though often resented, leader of the Third Crusade. With Acre secured, the Crusaders' next objective was Jerusalem. Richard, however, understood the strategic necessity of controlling the coastal strip, the vital supply route to the Holy City. He began a methodical march south, his army moving in a disciplined formation along the coast, always keeping the sea, and thus his supply ships, close at hand. Saladin, a master tactician, shadowed the Crusader army, seeking an opportune moment to strike. The two great commanders, each a legend in his own time, were now on a collision course. The decisive engagement came on September 7th, 1191, at the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin, hoping to break the Crusader formation and inflict a crushing defeat, launched a series of relentless attacks on Richard's marching column. His light cavalry and archers harried the Crusader flanks, attempting to draw them out into a disorganized charge. Richard, however, maintained strict discipline, his knights holding their lines despite the provocation. The heat was stifling, the dust blinding, and the constant barrage of arrows and skirmishes pushed the Crusaders to their breaking point. Finally, a contingent of Hospitaller knights, unable to endure the torment any longer, broke ranks and charged into the Saracen lines. This unplanned charge, though initially a breach of discipline, was quickly exploited by Richard. Seeing the opportunity, he ordered a full-scale cavalry charge. The Crusader heavy cavalry, a thunderous wave of steel and horseflesh, crashed into Saladin's forces, who were caught off guard by the sudden shift from defense to offense. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the disciplined charge of the Crusader knights, led by Richard himself, proved decisive. Saladin's army was routed, suffering heavy casualties. The Battle of Arsuf was a significant victory for Richard, demonstrating his tactical genius and the formidable power of his heavy cavalry. It secured the coastal road and opened the path to Jaffa, a crucial port city. Despite these victories, the path to Jerusalem remained fraught with challenges. Richard led his army twice to within sight of the Holy City, once in December 1191 and again in June 1192. On both occasions, after careful reconnaissance and deliberation, he made the agonizing decision not to attack. His reasons were pragmatic and strategically sound, though deeply unpopular with many of his crusaders who yearned to reclaim the sacred city. Richard understood that even if Jerusalem could be captured, holding it would be a monumental task. The Crusader army was depleted, far from its supply bases, and surrounded by a hostile population. Saladin's forces, though defeated at Arsuf, were still largely intact and could easily besiege a recaptured Jerusalem, cutting off its supplies and eventually forcing its surrender. Without a secure hinterland and sufficient manpower to garrison the city, any victory would be fleeting. This decision, to turn back from Jerusalem not once but twice, is one of the most debated aspects of Richard's crusade. Many historians argue that it was a testament to his strategic foresight, a cold, hard assessment of military realities that trumped emotional fervour. Others contend that it was a failure of nerve, a moment when the Lionheart's courage faltered. The reality is likely more nuanced. Richard was a brilliant military commander, but he was also a king with a kingdom to govern. He knew his resources were finite, and the longer he remained in the Holy Land, the more precarious his position back home became, especially with Philip Augustus waiting in the wings. Ultimately, Richard and Saladin, two of history's most formidable adversaries, entered into negotiations. Their respect for each other, forged in the crucible of battle, allowed for a dialogue that might have been impossible between lesser men. Saladin admired Richard's courage and chivalry, while Richard acknowledged Saladin's military prowess and magnanimity. In September 1192, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The terms were a compromise. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were granted safe passage to visit the holy sites. The Crusaders retained control of a strip of land along the coast, from Jaffa to Tyre, providing them with a foothold in the Levant. The Third Crusade, despite its initial promise and the immense efforts of its participants, did not achieve its primary objective, the recapture of Jerusalem. Frederick Barbarossa's tragic death, Philip Augustus's early departure, and Richard's strategic decisions meant that the Holy City remained in Muslim hands. Yet it was not a complete failure. The Crusaders had secured key coastal cities, re-established a Latin presence in the Levant, and demonstrated the continued military might of Western Europe. Richard's campaigns, particularly the Battle of Arsuf, became legendary, cementing his reputation as one of the greatest warrior kings. Richard departed the Holy Land in October 1192, his mission incomplete, his heart perhaps heavy with the knowledge that he had not fulfilled his vow to reclaim Jerusalem. His journey home, however, was to be even more perilous than his journey to the east. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, he attempted to travel disguised through Europe, but was captured by Duke Leopold V of Austria, whom he had offended during the Siege of Acre. Leopold, in turn, handed him over to Emperor Henry VI, Barbarossa's son, who held Richard for a substantial ransom. This episode highlights the complex web of political rivalries that often overshadowed the religious zeal of the Crusades. Richard's absence from England and the enormous ransom required for his release would have profound consequences for his kingdom. The Third Crusade left a lasting legacy. It showcased the military genius of both Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, two figures who became almost mythical in their own lifetimes. It also exposed the deep divisions and rivalries within the European leadership, demonstrating how personal ambition and political maneuvering could undermine even the most sacred of endeavors. While Jerusalem remained elusive, the Crusades solidified the Crusader States' hold on the coast and established a fragile but enduring truce that allowed for continued Christian pilgrimage. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem, however, would continue to burn brightly, fueling future crusades and shaping the course of medieval history for generations to come. The taste of victory at Acre, the strategic brilliance at Arsuf, but the ultimate turning away from Jerusalem. These were the complex, often contradictory, threads woven into the tapestry of this grand, yet ultimately incomplete, chapter in the Crusades. The vibrant tapestry of the Crusades, woven with threads of faith, ambition, and conflict, took a dramatically darker turn as the 13th century dawned. The call for a Fourth Crusade, issued by Pope Innocent III in 1198, was intended to reclaim Jerusalem, a city that still burned in the hearts of many Europeans. Yet the path this crusade would ultimately carve was one of profound betrayal and lasting bitterness, forever altering the relationship between the Latin West and the Byzantine East. Initial enthusiasm for the Fourth Crusade was lukewarm. Many seasoned nobles and knights were exhausted by previous campaigns, and the memory of the Third Crusade's immense cost and limited gains still lingered. However, a core group of French and Flemish knights, led by figures like Boniface of Montferrat, eventually answered the call. Their grand strategy involved a direct assault on Egypt, the perceived heart of Ayyubid power, believing that controlling this rich land would cripple the Muslim forces and pave the way for Jerusalem's recapture. But this ambitious plan immediately encountered a formidable obstacle: transportation. The Crusaders, lacking a fleet of their own, turned to the maritime Republic of Venice, the city whose very foundations seemed to rise from the sea itself, its wealth built on trade and its power on naval might. Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man of advanced age but sharp intellect and unwavering ambition, saw in the Crusaders' predicament a golden opportunity for Venice. A deal was struck. Venice would construct and provision a massive fleet capable of transporting over 30,000 men and thousands of horses, a colossal undertaking for the time. In return, the Crusaders pledged a staggering sum of 85,000 silver marks. However, when the Crusaders began to gather in Venice in the summer of 1202, it became painfully clear they could not meet their financial obligations. Only about a third of the promised sum materialized, leaving the Venetians with a massive investment and an unpaid debt. Dandolo, ever the pragmatist, proposed a solution that would forever stain the Crusades' reputation. He offered to defer the debt if the Crusaders would first help Venice capture the city of Zara, modern-day Zadar, on the Dalmatian coast. Zara was a Christian city, and though it had once been under Venetian control, it had since fallen under the protection of the King of Hungary, himself a Catholic. This proposal sent shockwaves through the Crusader ranks. Many were appalled at the thought of attacking fellow Christians, and papal legates explicitly forbade it. But the majority, desperate to fulfill their vows and with no other means of transport, reluctantly agreed. In November 1202, the Crusader fleet, a magnificent and terrifying sight, sailed into the harbour of Zara. The city fell after a brief siege, its Christian inhabitants massacred or enslaved, its wealth plundered. Pope Innocent III, upon hearing of this atrocity, excommunicated the entire Crusader army. Though he later lifted the excommunication for those who genuinely repented, excluding the Venetians. The diversion to Zara was merely the first step down a path of increasing moral compromise. While wintering in Zara, another, even more tempting proposition arose. Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince, arrived in the Crusader camp. He was the son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II Angelos and sought the Crusaders' aid in restoring his father to the throne of Constantinople. In exchange, Alexios promised an astronomical sum of money, military support for the crusade, and the reunification of the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome. The offer was irresistible to many, particularly the Venetians, who harboured long-standing grievances and commercial rivalries with Constantinople. Despite fervent protests from some Crusaders who insisted on the original goal of Jerusalem, the majority, swayed by the promise of immense wealth and the perceived legitimacy of restoring a rightful emperor, agree to sail for Constantinople. In July 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the formidable walls of Constantinople, a city often described as the Queen of Cities, whose defences had withstood countless sieges over centuries. The sight must have been breathtaking. Towering walls, intricate palaces, and the gleaming domes of countless churches, all bathed in the golden light of the Bosphorus. The Crusaders successfully breached the city's defences, and Isaac II Angelos was restored to the throne, with his son Alexios IV as co-emperor. However, the promised payments and religious reunification never fully materialized. The Byzantine populace resented the Latin presence and the heavy taxes levied to pay the Crusaders. Tensions escalated, leading to riots and a growing anti-Latin sentiment within the city. In January 1204, a palace coup overthrew Alexios IV, replacing him with a new emperor, Alexios V Doukas. This new emperor, fiercely anti-Western, refused to honor the agreements made by his predecessor. The Crusaders, now stranded outside the city, unpaid and increasingly desperate, made a fateful decision. They would take Constantinople by force. What followed in April 1204 was one of the most tragic and shameful episodes in Crusader history. The city, which had stood as a bastion of Christian civilization for nearly 1,000 years, fell to the Latin Crusaders. The sack of Constantinople was a catastrophe of epic proportions. For 3 days, the Crusaders engaged in an orgy of plunder, destruction, and violence. Churches, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, were desecrated, their altars smashed, their sacred relics stolen. Priceless artworks, ancient manuscripts, and imperial treasures were either looted or destroyed. The city's inhabitants, fellow Christians, were subjected to rape, murder, and enslavement. The sheer scale of the devastation was immense, leaving Constantinople a shadow of its former glory. Historians still debate the exact motivations behind the extreme brutality. Was it pure greed, fueled by desperation and resentment? Or was it a deep-seated cultural and religious animosity that had festered between the Latin West and the Greek East for centuries? Regardless, the sack irrevocably shattered any hope of reconciliation between the two branches of Christianity and permanently weakened the Byzantine Empire, leaving it vulnerable to future invasions. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was established, a short-lived and unstable entity that would struggle for survival for the next 57 years. The Fourth Crusade, intended to reclaim Jerusalem, had instead led to the destruction of a Christian capital and the profound alienation of the Eastern Orthodox world. Its legacy was one of betrayal and division, a stark reminder of how easily noble intentions could be corrupted by ambition and circumstance. The subsequent Crusades, though less infamous than the Fourth, continued to grapple with similar challenges of logistics, funding, and shifting objectives. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, once again set its sights on Egypt, recognizing its strategic importance. This expedition, led by figures like King Andrew II of Hungary and Duke Leopold VI of Austria, aimed to capture the port city of Damietta at the mouth of the Nile. After a protracted and costly siege, Damietta fell in 1219. The Crusaders, under the guidance of the papal legate Pelagius, then found themselves in a strong negotiating position. Facing internal strife and eager to avoid further conflict, offered to exchange Jerusalem for Damietta. This was an astonishing offer, seemingly fulfilling the ultimate goal of the Crusades without further bloodshed. However, Pelagius, driven by a fervent belief that God would grant them total victory and perhaps a touch of inflexibility, rejected the offer. He insisted on marching on Cairo, believing that the heart of Egypt was within their grasp. This decision proved disastrous. The Crusaders advanced up the Nile, but the Ayyubids, under the brilliant leadership of Al-Kamil, opened the floodgates of the Nile, trapping the Crusader army in the rising waters and turning the surrounding land into a muddy, impassable swamp. Starving and surrounded, the Crusaders were forced to surrender in 1221, relinquishing Damietta and returning home in ignominy. The Fifth Crusade, like its predecessor, ended in failure, a testament to the dangers of overconfidence and poor strategic judgment. A few years later, in 1228, the Sixth Crusade unfolded, a truly unique and controversial expedition led by Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. Frederick was a man of immense intellect and cultural sophistication, fluent in Arabic and deeply interested in Islamic philosophy. He was also a fiercely independent monarch who had repeatedly defied the Pope, leading to his excommunication. Despite this, Frederick had vowed to go on crusade. He arrived in the Holy Land not with a massive army, but with a relatively small force, and more importantly, with a diplomatic approach that shocked many of his contemporaries. Instead of fighting, Frederick engaged in negotiations with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, the same sultan who had defeated the Fifth Crusade. The two rulers, both highly educated and pragmatic, developed a surprising rapport. In 1229, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa, a remarkable diplomatic achievement. The treaty returned Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem to Christian control, along with a corridor to the coast. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem were to remain under Muslim control, and Muslims were allowed to worship freely in the city. Frederick, despite being excommunicated, entered Jerusalem and crowned himself king, a move that further infuriated the Pope. The Sixth Crusade achieved its primary objective, the peaceful restoration of Jerusalem to Christian rule, through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. However, it was widely condemned by the papacy and many devout Christians who saw Frederick's methods as a scandalous compromise with the infidel. The peace established by the Treaty of Jaffa was fragile and short-lived, dependent on the goodwill of both Frederick and al-Kamil. When Frederick left the Holy Land, the internal squabbles among Christian factions and the shifting power dynamics in the Muslim world soon undermined the agreement. Jerusalem would once again fall out of Christian hands in 1244, seized by Khwarezmian mercenaries, an event that deeply shocked Europe and spurred the call for yet another crusade. The Seventh Crusade, launched in 1248, was led by one of the most devout and revered monarchs of the age, King Louis IX of France. Later canonized as Saint Louis. Louis was a man of deep piety, unwavering faith, and a genuine desire to serve God. He envisioned a large-scale expedition to Egypt, believing that controlling the Nile Delta was the key to securing the Holy Land. After meticulous preparations, Louis led a formidable army to Damietta, which he captured relatively easily in 1249. However, the subsequent campaign mirrored the failures of the Fifth Crusade. Louis's army, attempting to advance on Cairo, became bogged down in the Nile Delta. Disease and skirmishes took their toll. A crucial battle at Mansoura in 1250 resulted in a devastating defeat for the Crusaders, with many prominent knights killed. King Louis himself was captured along with a significant portion of his army. The humiliation was immense. Louis was eventually ransomed for a vast sum and the return of Damietta, though he remained in the Holy Land for several more years, attempting to rebuild fortifications and negotiate alliances. His efforts yielded little lasting success. The Seventh Crusade, despite the piety and dedication of its leader, ended in strategic failure and immense human cost. The Eighth Crusade, also led by Louis IX in 1270, was another attempt to strike at the heart of Muslim power. His time in Tunis. Louis, still driven by his crusading zeal, believed that converting the Sultan of Tunis to Christianity, or at least securing his alliance, would weaken the Mamluks in Egypt and aid the Christian cause in the Levant. However, upon landing in Tunis, disease, likely dysentery, swept through the Crusader camp. King Louis IX himself succumbed to the illness in August 1270. His dying words, reportedly a prayer for Jerusalem. His death marked the effective end of large-scale crusading expeditions by European monarchs. The final vestiges of the Latin East were slowly but inexorably eroded. The Mamluks, a powerful military caste that had risen to prominence in Egypt, proved to be formidable adversaries. Under sultans like Baybars and Kalawan, they systematically dismantled the remaining Crusader strongholds. The great fortress city of Antioch fell in 1268, followed by Tripoli in 1289. The ultimate blow came in 1291 with the Fall of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant. The siege of Acre was a brutal and desperate affair. Despite valiant resistance, the Mamluk forces, vastly superior in numbers and siege technology, eventually overwhelmed the defenders. The city was sacked, its inhabitants massacred or enslaved, and its fortifications systematically dismantled to prevent any future Crusader return. The Fall of Acre marked the end of the Crusader States in the Levant. For nearly 2 centuries, a Latin presence had flickered in the Holy Land, a testament to European ambition and religious fervour. But by the close of the 13th century, that flame had been extinguished. The dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the East had dissolved, leaving behind a complex legacy of cultural exchange, technological innovation, profound religious division, and lasting bitterness. The later Crusades, from the 4th onward, demonstrate a significant shift in focus and a growing disillusionment. The initial fervour had waned, replaced by more pragmatic and often cynical objectives. The ideal of reclaiming Jerusalem often took a back seat to political manoeuvring, commercial interests, and personal gain. The repeated failures, the immense cost in lives and resources, and the moral compromises, particularly the sack of Constantinople, eroded public support and papal authority. The crusading movement, however, did not simply vanish. Its spirit, albeit transformed, continued to manifest in various forms. Crusades were called against heretics within Europe, such as the Albigensian Crusade in southern France in the early 13th century, which brutally suppressed the Cathar movement and significantly strengthened the French monarchy. Crusades were also directed against pagan peoples in the Baltic region, leading to the expansion of German and Scandinavian influence. The Teutonic Knights, a powerful military order, played a significant role in these northern crusades, establishing a vast monastic state in Prussia and Livonia. The idea of a crusade also evolved into a more generalized concept of a holy war or a righteous struggle against perceived enemies of the faith, whether internal or external. Even as the physical presence of Crusader states in the Levant faded into history, the rhetoric and imagery of the Crusades continued to resonate in European thought and politics for centuries, influencing everything from chivalric literature to colonial expansion. The legacy of the Crusades is multifaceted and deeply contested. For Europeans, they were often remembered as heroic endeavours, a testament to Christian piety and martial prowess, even if marred by setbacks. For the Byzantine Greeks, they represented a profound betrayal and the weakening of their empire, ultimately contributing to its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. For the Muslim world, the Crusades were an invasion, a series of brutal incursions by foreign aggressors that, while ultimately repelled, left a lasting scar on their collective memory. The Peri profoundly shaped the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean, fostered cultural and intellectual exchange, and left an indelible mark on religious identity and interfaith relations that continues to be felt and debated to this very day. The echoes of those distant battles, the whispers of forgotten treaties, and the enduring questions about faith, power, and humanity's capacity for both nobility and cruelty still resonate across the centuries. The sun-drenched plains of Egypt, shimmering with an almost mirage-like intensity, became the unlikely stage for the final, fervent acts of the crusading drama. Here, in the mid-13th century, a new and formidable power had risen, the Mamluks, a military caste forged in the crucible of war, whose very name, meaning owned or slave, belied their immense strength and strategic brilliance. And it was against this burgeoning force that one of the most devout and celebrated monarchs of the age, Louis IX of France, would launch his grand, ill-fated expeditions. Louis, known to history as Saint Louis, was a king steeped in piety, a man who wore a hair shirt beneath his royal robes, and who, it was said, personally washed the feet of the poor. His faith was not a political tool, but the very bedrock of his being, and for him, the liberation of Jerusalem was a sacred duty, a divine calling that transcended earthly concerns. He had taken the cross during a severe illness in the year 1244, vowing to lead a crusade if he recovered, and upon his miraculous recovery, he dedicated the next 4 years to meticulous preparations. This was no impulsive venture, but a carefully planned undertaking, funded by heavy taxation and driven by a king's unshakable belief. In 1248, Louis set sail with a massive fleet from Aigues-Mortes, a new port he had specifically constructed for this purpose on the Mediterranean coast of France. The sheer scale of the endeavour was breathtaking. Thousands of knights, men-at-arms and support staff, their banners snapping in the wind, their armour glinting under the southern sun. The initial target was Egypt, a strategic choice, for control of the Nile Delta would cripple the Ayyubid Sultanate, the dominant Muslim power in the region, and open a path to Jerusalem. The landing at Damietta, a fortified port city at the mouth of the Nile, was swift and successful in June 1249. The Muslim defenders, caught off guard, abandoned the city, leaving it to the Crusaders. This early victory, however, proved to be a deceptive omen. The Crusaders settled into Damietta for a long, hot summer, waiting for the Nile floods to recede before advancing inland. This delay, while perhaps militarily prudent, allowed the Ayyubids to regroup and, crucially, allowed the Mamluks to consolidate their power within the Sultanate. As winter approached, Louis decided to march on Mansoura, a key city deeper in the delta. The campaign was arduous, marked by fierce skirmishes and the constant harassment of Mamluk forces. The Crusaders, accustomed to the cooler climes of Europe, struggled with the heat. The unfamiliar terrain and the relentless pressure from their agile opponents. A pivotal moment came in February 1250, during the Battle of Mansoura. The vanguard of the Crusader army, led by Louis's brother, Robert of Artois, impetuously charged into the city, only to be trapped and annihilated in the narrow streets. Robert himself was killed, a devastating blow to the Crusader morale. Louis, despite falling gravely ill with dysentery, fought with extraordinary courage, refusing to abandon his men. But the tide had turned irrevocably. The Crusader army, weakened by disease, starvation, and constant attacks, was forced to retreat. The retreat quickly devolved into a desperate rout. Louis, too weak to ride, was captured along with many of his remaining knights. The humiliation was profound. A king of France, a saintly monarch, held captive by his Muslim adversaries. The ransom demanded for Louis and his army was immense. the surrender of Damietta, and a staggering sum of 800,000 bezants. Louis, ever the devout, reportedly negotiated the terms even from his sickbed, ensuring the release of his men. He was eventually freed in May 1250, but the dream of conquering Egypt was shattered. Despite this crushing defeat, Louis did not immediately return to France. Instead, he sailed to Acre, one of the last remaining Crusader strongholds in the Levant. Our years, he dedicated himself to strengthening the defences of the remaining Frankish states, negotiating treaties and attempting to secure the release of more prisoners. He spent vast sums of his own treasury on rebuilding fortifications and improving the infrastructure of cities like Acre, Caesarea, and Sidon. His presence, his unwavering faith, and his personal integrity provided a much-needed moral boost to the beleaguered Crusader communities. He even sent envoys as far as the Mongol Empire, hoping to forge an alliance against the Mamluks, a testament to his persistent, if ultimately fruitless, strategic thinking. Historians still debate the wisdom of Louis's decision to remain in the Holy Land after the Egyptian disaster. Some argue that his presence was vital for the survival of the Latin states, preventing their immediate collapse. Others contend that his prolonged absence from France weakened his kingdom, and that his resources would have been better spent at home. Regardless, his commitment was absolute. Upon his return to France in 1254, Louis ruled with a quiet authority, instituting legal reforms, promoting justice, and fostering a period of peace and prosperity. Yet, the call of the cross continued to echo in his heart. The fall of Antioch to the Mamluks in 1268, a brutal event that saw the massacre of its inhabitants and the destruction of one of the oldest Christian cities, deeply affected him. It was a stark reminder of the dwindling fortunes of the Crusader States. In 1270, Louis, now an aging king, embarked on his Second Crusade, the Eighth Crusade. This time, his target was Tunis, on the coast of North Africa. The motivations for this choice are still somewhat shrouded in mystery. Some chronicles suggest he believed the Sultan of Tunis could be converted to Christianity, or that it was a strategic move to disrupt Mamluk supply lines. Others believe he was simply seeking to follow the path of his ancestor, Louis VII, who had also crusaded in North Africa. Perhaps it was a last, desperate attempt to find a new avenue to the Holy Land, a way around the formidable Mamluk defences. The expedition, however, was plagued by misfortune from the outset. Disease, likely dysentery or typhus, swept through the Crusader camp shortly after their arrival near Carthage. The scorching summer heat and unsanitary conditions created a fertile ground for illness. The Crusader army, already weakened, began to succumb. Louis himself fell gravely ill. On August 25, 1270, Louis IX, the saintly king, died near Tunis, reportedly uttering the name of Jerusalem with his last breath. His death marked a tragic end to an era. His son, Philip III, who had accompanied him, quickly negotiated a truce with the Sultan of Tunis and returned to France, carrying his father's remains. The Eighth Crusade effectively ended with the king's death, achieving nothing of its original aims. The death of Louis IX, a monarch who embodied the crusading ideal with such unwavering devotion, seemed to extinguish the last flickering embers of the crusading spirit in Europe. While subsequent, smaller crusades were launched, they lacked the grand scale, the fervent piety, and the royal leadership that had characterized the earlier movements. The focus of European powers began to shift inward, towards consolidating their own kingdoms and engaging in internal conflicts. Meanwhile, in the Levant, The Mamluks, under a succession of brilliant and ruthless sultans like Baybars and Calawun, continued their relentless campaign to expel the remaining Frankish presence. They were a military machine of unparalleled efficiency, their cavalry renowned for its discipline and ferocity. Their strategy was methodical. Siege after siege, city after city, they systematically dismantled the Crusader strongholds. One of the lesser-known but significant aspects of Mamluk warfare was their mastery of siegecraft and logistics. They not only possessed powerful siege engines, but also understood the importance of cutting off supplies and demoralizing defenders. They were also adept at psychological warfare, often offering lenient terms of surrender only to renege on them, instilling fear and distrust among the Crusaders. The fall of Antioch in 1268 was a brutal prelude to what was to come. Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan, had captured the city after a swift siege, massacring its inhabitants and utterly destroying its fortifications. This act sent a chilling message throughout the remaining Crusader states. There would be no mercy, no quarter. The Mamluk advance continued unabated. In 1289, Tripoli, another major Crusader city, fell to Sultan Calawun after a month-long siege. The city, once a vibrant center of trade and culture, was razed to the ground, its population either killed or enslaved. The loss of Tripoli was a devastating blow, further ulcerating the remaining Crusader enclaves. The final act in this long, drawn-out drama unfolded in 1291 with the Siege of Acre. Acre was the last major Crusader stronghold, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and a bustling port city. It was a cosmopolitan hub, a melting pot of cultures, where merchants from east and west mingled, and the great military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, maintained their headquarters. Its walls were formidable, its defences seemingly impregnable. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, Calawun's son, led a massive Mamluk army to Acre, reportedly numbering over 100,000 men, equipped with a vast array of siege engines. The siege was one of the largest and most intense of the medieval period. For weeks, the Mamluks pounded the city walls with catapults and trebuchets, while the defenders, outnumbered and increasingly desperate, fought with incredible bravery. The defense was led by the Grand Masters of the military orders, along with remnants of European forces. They launched daring sorties, attempting to disrupt the Mamluk siege lines, but their efforts were ultimately futile against the overwhelming numerical superiority and relentless pressure of the Mamluk army. The Mamluks, in a testament to their engineering prowess, even managed to tunnel under sections of the walls, causing them to collapse. On May 18, 2091, after a siege of several weeks, the Mamluks finally breached the city's defences. What followed was a brutal and chaotic struggle in the streets. The defenders, fighting to the last, were overwhelmed. Many were killed, others captured and enslaved. The city was systematically plundered and then razed, its magnificent churches and fortifications reduced to rubble. The fall of Acre was more than just the loss of a city. It was the symbolic end of the Crusader States in the Levant. With Acre gone, the remaining smaller outposts along the coast, like Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, quickly fell or were abandoned. The dream of a permanent Christian presence in the Holy Land, born of the First Crusade almost 2 centuries earlier, was finally extinguished. The Crusades, as a major historical phenomenon, had come to an end. The motivations that had driven millions of Europeans to embark on these perilous journeys, religious fervor, the pursuit of salvation, political ambition, and economic opportunity, had waned. The Mamluks, a new and powerful force, had proven themselves to be insurmountable adversaries. The legacy of the Crusades, however, was far from over. The interactions, both violent and peaceful, between East and West had profound and lasting effects. Europe had been exposed to new ideas, new technologies, and new trade goods. The Crusades had helped to solidify the power of the papacy and the European monarchies, while also fostering a sense of shared European identity, albeit one forged in conflict. The memory of these holy wars would continue to echo through the centuries, shaping perceptions and influencing relations between different cultures and religions, a testament to the enduring power of belief. That and the often tragic consequences of its pursuit. The winds that once carried the banners of Crusader knights now whispered through empty ruins, carrying only the dust of forgotten dreams. The sun beat down on Acre in the late spring of 1291, a relentless, shimmering heat that seemed to bake the very stones of its formidable walls. For over a century, this bustling port city had been the vibrant, if precarious, heart of the Latin East, a final defiant outpost clinging to the shores of the Levant. Its markets teemed with merchants from Genoa and Venice. Its streets echoed with the clatter of armoured knights and the calls of street vendors. And its harbours bristled with ships bearing pilgrims and supplies from distant Europe. But beneath this veneer of bustling life, a deep unease had settled, a foreboding shadow cast by the relentless advance of the Mamluks. The Mamluks, a powerful military caste that had risen to prominence in Egypt, had been systematically dismantling the remaining Crusader states for decades. Their sultan, Calawun, had sworn an oath to expel the Franks entirely from Syria. And though he died before he could fulfill it, his son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, was determined to see his father's vow through. He assembled an army of unprecedented size, a vast host that dwarfed any force the Crusaders could hope to muster. Estimates vary, but chroniclers suggest an army numbering in the tens of thousands, equipped with formidable siege engines, marching inexorably towards Acre. Within Acre's walls, a stark and bitter reality had begun to set in. The city was a melting pot of various Crusader orders and factions, each with its own agenda and leadership. The Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the French, the English, the Pisans, the Genoese, all were present, but their unity was fragile, their cooperation often strained. John of Grailly, a seasoned knight and former seneschal of Jerusalem, had arrived with a small contingent of French forces, but it was a mere drop in the ocean compared to the Mamluk tide. The city's defences, though strong, were old, and the constant bickering among the various Christian factions had eroded their collective will. The siege began in earnest on April 5, 1291. The Mamluk army encircled the city, their banners fluttering in the desert wind, their siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, and mangonels meticulously positioned. The air soon filled with the terrifying thud of massive stones slamming into the city walls, the splintering of wood, and the cries of the defenders. Day after day, the Mamluks hammered at Acre's fortifications, focusing their attacks on key towers and gates. The Crusader defenders, though outnumbered, fought with a desperate courage, launching sorties, repairing breaches under cover of darkness, and raining arrows and stones down upon the attackers. One of the most fiercely contested areas was the Tower of the Accursed, a particularly vulnerable point in the city's outer wall. Here, the Mamluks concentrated their efforts, their sappers digging tunnels beneath its foundations, weakening the stone from below while their siege engines battered it from above. The defenders, led by the Grand Master of the Templars, Guillaume de Beaujeu, and the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, Jean de Villiers, fought relentlessly, but the sheer weight of the Mamluk assault was overwhelming. The Mamluks employed a tactic that had proven devastating in previous sieges: undermining. They dug tunnels beneath the walls, shoring them up with timber, and then setting the timber alight. As the wood burned away, the ground above would collapse, bringing down sections of the wall. This insidious method, combined with the constant bombardment, slowly but surely began to breach Acre's formidable defences. By mid-May, the situation inside Acre was dire. The outer walls had been severely compromised, and the Mamluks were preparing for a final, decisive assault. On May 18th, under the cover of a thick morning mist, the Mamluks launched their full-scale attack. Thousands of Mamluk soldiers surged forward, scaling the damaged walls, pouring through the breaches. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, a desperate hand-to-hand struggle in the narrow streets and crumbling fortifications. The defenders, exhausted and depleted, fought valiantly. Guillaume de Beaujeu, the Grand Master of the Templars, was mortally wounded while leading a counterattack, a devastating blow to the morale of his knights. The Hospitallers, too, suffered heavy losses. As the Mamluks gained ground, panic began to spread among the civilian population. Many tried to flee to the harbour, hoping to find safety on the ships, but the Mamluk advance was too swift. The Fall of Acre was not a single, clean event, but a series of desperate struggles and retreats. As the Mamluks overwhelmed the outer defences, the remaining Crusader forces fell back to the inner city, and then to the Templar fortress, a formidable citadel on the southwestern edge of the city. Here, a small contingent of Templars, led by the Marshal Peter de Sèvres, made a final, heroic stand. They held out for several more days, surrounded by the victorious Mamluks, refusing to surrender. Historians still debate the exact circumstances of the Templar fortress's final moments. Some accounts suggest that the Mamluks offered terms of surrender, promising safe passage for the remaining knights and civilians. However, when a group of Mamluks entered the fortress to oversee the surrender, they reportedly began to molest the women and children who had taken refuge there. Enraged, the Templars attacked the Mamluks, killing them all, and then barricaded themselves inside, determined to fight to the last man. The Mamluks, infuriated by this perceived treachery, renewed their assault with even greater ferocity. They undermined the fortress, and on May 28th, the massive structure collapsed, burying the remaining Templars and their Mamluk attackers beneath its rubble. The Fall of Acre was a catastrophic defeat for the Crusader cause. The city was systematically sacked and destroyed by the Mamluks, its churches converted into mosques, its fortifications razed to prevent any future European attempts to reclaim it. The remaining Crusader strongholds along the coast, such as Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, soon fell without significant resistance. The Latin presence in the Levant, which had begun with such fervent zeal nearly 2 centuries earlier, was definitively over. The news of Acre's fall sent shockwaves across Europe. For many, it was a profound spiritual blow, a sign that God had abandoned the Crusader enterprise. Pope Nicholas IV tried to organize a new crusade, but the enthusiasm and resources that had once fueled such expeditions had largely evaporated. The political landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically. Monarchs were more concerned with internal conflicts and consolidating their own power than with distant holy wars. The economic incentives, once a powerful draw, had also diminished as new trade routes opened up and the risks of venturing into the Levant increased. The end of the Crusader States in the Levant marked a significant turning point in European history. It forced a re-evaluation of the relationship between East and West. While direct military confrontation ceased, trade and cultural exchange continued, though often under different terms. The Crusades had left an indelible mark on both European and Middle Eastern societies, shaping their identities, their perceptions of each other, and their future trajectories. The legacy of the Crusades, however, was not simply one of military failure. They had spurred significant developments in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography. They had introduced new technologies, agricultural products, and luxury goods to Europe, stimulating economic growth and cultural exchange. They had also contributed to the rise of powerful military orders, like the Templars and Hospitallers, whose influence extended far beyond the battlefield, impacting banking, land ownership, and political power within Europe. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was the profound shift in European self-perception. The Crusades, initially conceived as a unified Christian effort, had ultimately fractured European unity and exposed the deep divisions within its political and religious landscape. The dream of a lasting Christian kingdom in the Holy Land had vanished, replaced by a more pragmatic and often cynical approach to international relations. The focus of European power began to shift westward, towards the burgeoning nation-states of England, France, and Spain, and towards the exploration of new sea routes to the east. The Fall of Acre was not merely the end of a city, it was the symbolic end of an era. The age of grand, religiously motivated military expeditions to the east had passed. The Crusader castles, once symbols of European power, now stood as silent, crumbling monuments to a bygone age, their stones whispering tales of ambition, piety, and ultimately, loss. The dream of Jerusalem, once a rallying cry for kings and peasants alike, receded into the realm of legend, a poignant reminder of a time when faith and fervour could move armies across continents. The Mediterranean, once a highway for Crusader fleets, now became a sea of changing alliances and shifting powers, its waters reflecting a new chapter in the complex tapestry of human history. The echoes of the siege engines, the cries of battle, and the prayers of the faithful faded into the wind, leaving behind only the enduring memory of a world forever transformed. The echoes of the Crusades, though the last of the major expeditions had long faded, reverberated through the very bedrock of European society and beyond, shaping destinies in ways few could have foreseen. The profound interplay of these centuries of conflict left a complex and often contradictory legacy, weaving itself into the fabric of East and West, influencing everything from political structures to artistic expression. One of the most immediate and tangible legacies was the transformation of European self-perception and its relationship with the wider world. Before the Crusades, Europe, particularly Western Europe, was largely insular, its gaze fixed inward upon its own feudal squabbles and nascent kingdoms. The Crusades, however, forced a dramatic outward expansion of horizons. Thousands of Europeans, from humble peasants to powerful lords, traveled vast distances, encountering cultures, technologies, and ideas vastly different from their own. This exposure, though often born of conflict, undeniably broadened intellectual and cultural perspectives. The introduction of new goods and trade routes stands as a testament to this expanded worldview. Returning crusaders and merchants who followed in their wake brought back a wealth of exotic spices, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, which transformed European cuisine and created new demands. Silks, fine textiles, perfumes, and precious stones from the East became highly coveted, stimulating a burgeoning luxury trade. New agricultural products like sugarcane, rice, apricots, and lemons were introduced to European cultivation, enriching diets and agricultural practices. Even seemingly minor innovations like the compass, Arabic numerals, and advanced shipbuilding techniques, though not directly invented by crusaders, saw their adoption and widespread use accelerated through increased contact with the sophisticated maritime and intellectual traditions of the Islamic world. This commercial exchange laid critical groundwork for the later age of exploration, as European powers, having tasted the riches of the East, sought new and direct routes to their sources. Beyond material goods, the intellectual ferment sparked by contact with Islamic civilization was profound. While the Crusades were characterized by religious antagonism, they also facilitated a degree of intellectual exchange, particularly in areas where Islamic scholarship had far surpassed that of the Latin West. European scholars, particularly in places like Sicily and Spain, which had long been under Muslim rule, gained access to vast libraries and Arabic translations of ancient Greek texts. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and Ptolemy that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. This rediscovery, often facilitated by Jewish scholars who acted as intermediaries, ignited the intellectual revival of the 12th and 13th centuries, contributing significantly to the scholastic movement and laying foundations for the Renaissance. The very concept of the university as a structured institution of higher learning was influenced by the madrasas of the Islamic world. However, this legacy of exchange was deeply intertwined with a legacy of division and animosity. The Crusades undeniably exacerbated the schism between the Latin West and the Greek East. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade, an act of unparalleled brutality against fellow Christians, left an indelible scar on Byzantine-Western relations that never truly healed. It cemented a deep-seated distrust and resentment that persisted for centuries, weakening the Byzantine Empire and arguably contributing to its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. This event remains a potent symbol of the destructive potential of religious fervor when unchecked by moral restraint. The Crusades also solidified and intensified a particular image of the other in the European imagination. Muslims, often depicted as infidels and enemies of Christ, became a convey. Neant foil against which European identity could be forged. This demonization, while serving to galvanize support for the crusading ideal, also fostered centuries of prejudice and misunderstanding. Conversely, in the Islamic world, the Frankish invasions, though ultimately repelled, left a lasting memory of foreign aggression and religious fanaticism. Historians still debate the extent to which the Crusades shaped long-term Muslim attitudes towards the West, with some arguing that they were a relatively minor episode in the grand sweep of Islamic history, while others contend they sowed seeds of resentment that endure to this day. Within Europe itself, the Crusades had significant social and political ramifications. The absence of many powerful lords on crusade often led to shifts in feudal power structures. Royal authority sometimes expanded as kings consolidated lands left leaderless or acquired through Crusader debts. The financing of these massive expeditions necessitated new forms of taxation and financial management, contributing to the development of more sophisticated governmental bureaucracies. The rise of military orders like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, unique blends of monasticism and knighthood, demonstrated a new form of religious devotion and military organization. While initially powerful and wealthy, their eventual suppression, particularly the brutal dissolution of the Templars in the early 14th century, highlighted the dangers of unchecked power and the shifting political landscape. The Crusades also provided a significant outlet for the restless energy of the European knightly class, channeling their martial prowess towards a religiously sanctioned goal. This, some historians argue, may have temporarily reduced internal conflict within Europe, though it certainly did not eliminate it. The concept of chivalry itself, though existing before the Crusades, was further refined and romanticized through the tales of crusading heroes, emphasizing virtues like courage, honor, and religious devotion, even if the reality on the ground often fell far short of these ideals. Culturally, the Crusades inspired an immense body of literature, art, and music. Epic poems and chansons de geste, like the Chanson de Roland, though predating the First Crusade, found new resonance in the tales of Christian warriors battling infidels. Chronicles written by participants, such as William of Tyre's Historia Rerum in Partibus Transmarinis Gestarum, History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea, provided detailed, if often biased, accounts that shaped later understandings of the events. These narratives, often imbued with a sense of divine purpose and heroic struggle, became foundational myths for European identity, influencing national narratives and popular imagination for centuries. The architectural legacy, too, is profound. From the imposing Crusader castles dotting the Levant to the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, whose construction was often financed by crusading fervor and the wealth generated by new trade. The very imagery of the cross, adopted as a symbol by Crusaders, became an enduring emblem of Western Christianity, its meaning forever intertwined with the Holy Wars. The impact on religious devotion was equally complex. While the Crusades were initially fueled by genuine piety and a desire to secure holy sites, the repeated failures and the often brutal realities of warfare led to periods of disillusionment and introspection. The concept of pilgrimage, central to medieval Christianity, was irrevocably altered. While the journey to Jerusalem remained important, the focus shifted from solely spiritual devotion to a more militarized and political undertaking. The papacy, which had initially gained immense prestige and power by calling and directing the Crusades, also saw its authority challenged as the failures mounted. The later Crusades, particularly the Albigensian Crusade against heretics within Europe, demonstrate how the crusading ideal could be repurposed for internal political and religious control, blurring the lines between holy war and secular ambition. Even the very language we use today bears traces of this era. Words like crusade itself, Saracen, and infidel entered the lexicon, carrying with them the historical weight of these conflicts. The romanticized image of the crusader, noble and devout, battling against overwhelming odds, has persisted in art, literature, and even modern political rhetoric, often stripped of its historical complexities and used to justify contemporary actions. The Crusades, therefore, were not merely a series of military expeditions. They were a transformative epoch that irrevocably altered the course of history for both East and West. They were a crucible in which new identities were forged, new trade routes established, and new ideas exchanged, often amidst immense suffering and destruction. The legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of innovation and devastation, cultural exchange and profound division, religious fervor and political opportunism. The reverberations of these medieval holy wars continued to shape geopolitical relationships, cultural perceptions, and intellectual currents long after the last Crusader ship had sailed home, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of humanity, a testament to the enduring power of faith, ambition, and conflict.